Chapter 17 of A Silent Witness by R. Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 17. The Palimpsest. It was getting late when our friends left us, but nevertheless, as soon as they were gone, we all drew our chairs up to the fire with the obvious intention of discussing the situation, and began with one accord to fill our pipes. Jervis was the first to get his tobacco alight, and, having emitted a voluminous preliminary puff, he proceeded to open the debate. "That man Jardine seems to be a pretty desperate character. Just think of his actually wallowing in the mire, not merely rolling, mind you, but wallowing, and of his repulsive habit of consorting with females, one after the other too, in rapid succession. It's a shocking instance of depravity." "Our reverend friend," said Thorndyke, "reaches his conclusions by a rather short route, in some cases at least. In others his methods seem a little indirect and roundabout." "Yes," agreed Jervis, "he's a devil at guessing, but he didn't get much food for the imagination out of the man Thorndyke. Why were you so extraordinarily secretive? With what he told you and what you knew before, you could surely have suggested a line of inquiry. Why didn't you?" "Principally because of the man's personality. I could not have answered his questions. I could only have suggested one or two highly probable solutions of the problem that he offered, and partial solutions at that. But I am not much addicted to giving partial solutions, to handing over the raw material of a promising inquiry. Certainly not to a man like this, who seems incapable of a straightforward action." "The Reverend Father," said Jervis, "does certainly seem to be a rather unnecessarily downy bird. He doesn't seem to have got much by his excessive artfulness, after all." "No," agreed Thorndyke. "Nothing whatever. Quite the contrary, in fact. Look at his ridiculous conduct in respect of the man Jardine. I don't complain of his having taken the precaution to obtain that malefactor's address. But when he had got it, if he had not been tortuous, so eager to be cunning, if, in short, he had behaved like an ordinary sensible man, he would have got, at once, all the information that Jardine had to give. He could have called on Jardine, written to him, employed a lawyer, or applied to the police. Either of these simple and obvious plans would have been successful. Instead of which, he must needs go to the trouble and expense of engaging this absurd spy." "Who found a mare's nest and got his head thumped," remarked Jervis. "Then," continued Thorndyke, "look at his behaviour to Marchmont. Evidently he put the case into Marchmont's hands, but, equally evident, he withheld material facts and secretly tinkered at the case himself. No, Jervis, I give no information to Father Humperdinck until I have this case complete to the last rivet. But, all the same, I am greatly obliged to him, and especially to Marchmont, for bringing him here. He has given us a connected story to collate with our rather loose collection of facts, and, what is perhaps more important, he has put our investigation on a business footing. That is a great advantage. If I should want to invoke the aid of the powers that be, I can do so now with a definite locus standi as the legal representative of interested parties." "I can't imagine," said I, "in what direction you are going to push your inquiries. Father Humperdinck has given us, as you say, a connected story, but it is a very unexpected one, to me at least, and does not fall into line at all with what we know. That is, if you are assuming, as I have been, that the man whom I saw lying in Millfield Lane was Vitalis Reinhardt." "It is difficult," replied Thorndyke, "to avoid that assumption, though we must be on our guard against coincidences. But the man whom you saw agreed with the description that has been given to us. We know that Reinhardt was in the neighbourhood on that day, and you found the reliquary on the following morning in the immediate vicinity. We seem to be committed to the hypothesis that the man was Reinhardt, unless we can prove that he was someone else, or that Reinhardt was in some other place at the time, which at present we cannot." "Then," said I, "in that case the bobby must have been right after all. The man couldn't have been dead, seeing that he called on Marchmont the following day and was afterwards traced to Paris. But I must say that he looked as dead as Queen Anne. It just shows how careful one ought to be in giving opinions." "Some authority has said," remarked Jervis, "that the only conclusive proof of death is decomposition. I believe it was old Taylor who said so, and I'm inclined to think that he wasn't far wrong." "But," said Thorndyke, "assuming that the man whom you saw was Reinhardt, and that he was not dead, how do you explain the other circumstances? Was he insensible from the effects of injury or drugs, or was he deliberately shamming insensibility? Was it he who passed over the fence, and if so, did he climb over unassisted, or was he helped over? And what answers do you suggest to the questions that Marchmont propounded? You answer his first question, 'Is Reinhardt alive?' in the affirmative. What about the others?" "As to where he is," I replied, "I can only say the Lord knows, probably skulking somewhere on the Continent. As to his state of mind, the facts seem to suggest that, in vulgar parlance, he has gone off his onion. He must be as mad as a hatter to have behaved in the way that he has; for, even assuming that he wanted to get clear of the poor brothers of St. Jeremiah Diddler, without explicitly saying so, he adopted a fool's plan. There's no sense in masquerading as a corpse one day and turning up smiling at your lawyer's office the next. If he meant to be dead, he should have stuck to it and remained dead." "The objection to that," said Jervis, "is that Marchmont would have proceeded to get permission to presume death and administer the will." "I see. Then I can only suppose that he had got infected by Father Humperdinck and resolved to be artful at all costs and hang the consequences." "Then," said Thorndyke, "I understand your view to be that Reinhardt is at present hiding somewhere on the Continent, and that his mind is more or less affected." "Yes; though as to his being unfit to control his own affairs, I am not so clear. I fancy there was more evidence in that direction when he was forking out the bulk of his income to maintain the poverty of the poor brothers. But the truth is, I haven't any opinions on the case at all. I'm in a complete fog about the whole affair." "And no wonder," said Jervis. "One set of facts seems to suggest most strongly that Reinhardt must certainly be dead. Another set of facts seems to prove beyond doubt that he was alive, at least after that affair in Millfield Lane. He may be perpetrating an elephantine practical joke on the poor brothers, but that doesn't seem to be particularly probable. The whole case is a tangle of contradictions which one might regard as beyond unravelment, if it were not for a single clear and intelligible fact." "What is that?" I asked. "That my revered senior has undertaken to furnish a solution in the course of a month, from which I gather that my revered senior has something up his sleeve." "There is nothing up my sleeve," said Thorndyke, "that might not equally well be up yours. I have made no separate investigations. The actual data which I possess were acquired in the presence of one or both of you, and are now the common property of us all. I am referring, of course, to the original data, not to fresh matter obtained by inference from, or further examination of those data." Jervis smiled sardonically. "It is the old story," said he. "The magician offers you his hat to inspect. You observe, ladies and gentlemen, that there is no deception. You can look inside it and examine the lining, and you can also inspect the top of my head. I now put on my hat. I now take it off again, and you notice that there is a guinea pig sitting in it. There was no deception, ladies and gentlemen. You had all the data." Thorndyke laughed and shook his head. "That's all nonsense, Jervis," he said. "It is a false analogy. I've done nothing to divert your attention. The guinea pig has been staring you in the face all the time." "Very rude of him," murmured Jervis. "I've even drawn your attention to him once or twice. But seriously, I don't think that this case is so very obscure, though, mind you, it is a mere hypothesis so far as I am concerned, and may break down completely when I come to apply the tests that I have in view. But what I mean is, that the facts known to us suggested a very obvious hypothesis, and that the suggestion was offered equally to us all. The verification may fail, but that is another matter." "Are you going to work at the case immediately?" I asked. "No," Thorndyke replied. "Jervis and I have to attend at the Maidstone Assizes for the next few days. We are retained on a case which involves some very important issues in relation to life assurance, and that will take up most of our time. So this other affair will have to wait." "And meanwhile," said Jervis, "you will stay at home like a good boy and mind the shop, and I suppose we shall have to find you something to do to keep you out of mischief. What do you say to making a longhand transcript of Father Humperdinck's statement?" "Yes, you had better do that," said Thorndyke, "and attach it to the original shorthand copy. And now we must really turn in, or we shall never be ready for our start in the morning." The transcription of Father Humperdinck's statement gave me abundant occupation for the whole of the following morning, but when that was finished I was without any definite employment, and, though I was not in the least dull, for I was accustomed to a solitary life, I suppose I was in that state of susceptibility to mischief that is proverbially associated with unemployment, and in these untoward circumstances I was suddenly exposed to a great temptation, and after some feeble efforts at resistance, succumbed ignominiously. I shall offer no excuses for my conduct, nor seek in any way to mitigate the judgment that all discreet persons will pass upon my folly. I make no claims to discretion, or to the caution and foresight of a man like Thorndyke. At this time I was an impulsive and rather heedless young man, and my actions were pretty much those which might have been expected from a person of such temperament. The voice of the tempter issued in the first place from our letter-box, and assumed the sound of the falling of letters thereinto. I hastened to extract the catch, and sorting out the envelopes, selected one, the superscription of which was in Sylvia's now familiar handwriting. It was actually addressed to Dr. Thorndyke, but a private mark, on which we had agreed, exposed that naively pious fraud, and gave me the right to open it, which I did, and seated myself in the armchair to enjoy its perusal at my ease. It was a delightful letter, bright, gossipy, and full of frank and intimate friendliness. As I read it, the trim, graceful figure and pretty face of the writer rose before me, and made me wonder a little discontentedly how long it would be before I should look on her and hear her voice again. It was now getting into the 3rd week since I had last seen her, and, as the time passed, I was feeling more and more how great a blank in my life the separation from her had caused. Our friendship had grown up in a quiet and unsensational fashion, and I suppose I had not realized all that it meant. But I was realizing it now, and, as I conned over her letter, with its little personal notes and familiar turns of expression, I began to be consumed with a desire to see her, to hear her speak, to tell her that she was not as other women to me, and to claim a like special place in her thoughts. It was towards the end of the letter that the tempter spoke out in clear and unmistakable language, and these were the words that he used, through the medium of the innocent and unconscious Sylvia. "You remember those sketches that you stole from me? Pinched, I think was your own expression. Well, I've cleaned off the daubs of paint with which they had been disfigured, and put them in rough frames in my studio. All but one, and I began on that yesterday with a scraper and a rag dipped in chloroform. But I took off not only the defacing marks, but part of the surface as well. And then I got such a surprise! I shan't tell you what the surprise was, because you'll see when you come out of the house of bondage. I'm going to work on it again tomorrow, and perhaps I shall get the transformation finished. How I wish you could come and see it done! It takes away more than half the joy of exploration not to be able to share the discovery with you. In fact, I have a good mind to leave it unfinished so that we can complete the transformation together." Now, I need not say that, as to the precious sketches, I cared not a fig what was under the top coat of paint. What I did care for was that this dear maid was missing me as I missed her, was wanting my sympathy with her little interests and pleasures, and was telling me, half unconsciously perhaps, that my absence had created a blank in her life, as her absence had in mine. And forthwith I began to ask myself whether there was really any good reason why I should not, just for this once, break out of my prison and snatch a few brief hours of sunshine. The spy had been exploded. He was not likely to pick up my tracks after all this time, and now that my appearance was so altered. And I did not care much if he did, seeing that he had been shown to be perfectly harmless. The only circumstance that tended to restrain me from this folly was the one that mitigated its rashness, the change in my appearance, and even that, now that I was used to it and knew that my aspect was neither grotesque nor ridiculous, had little weight, for Sylvia would be prepared for the change and we could enjoy the joke together. I was aware even at the time that I was not being quite candid with myself, for, if I had been, I should obviously have consulted Thorndyke; instead of which I answered the letter by return, announcing my intention of coming to tea on the following day, and having sent Polton out to post it, spent the remainder of the afternoon in gleeful anticipation of my little holiday, tempered by some nervousness as to what Thorndyke would have to say on the matter, and as to what my pretty friend, as Mrs. Samway had very appropriately called her, would think of my having begun my letter with the words, "My dear Sylvia." Nothing happened to interfere with my nefarious plans. On the following morning Thorndyke and Jervis went off after an early breakfast, leaving me in possession of the premises and master of my actions. I elected to anticipate the usual luncheon time by half an hour, and, when this meal was disposed of, I crept to my room and thoroughly cleansed my hair of the grease which Polton still persisted in applying to it; for, since my hat would conceal it while I was out of doors, the added disfigurement was unnecessary. I was even tempted to tamper slightly with my eyebrows, but this impulse I nobly resisted, and, having dried my hair and combed it in its normal fashion, I descended on tiptoe to the sitting-room and wrote a short explanatory note to Polton, which I left conspicuously on the table. Then I switched the door-bell on to the laboratory, and letting myself out like a retreating burglar, closed the door silently and sneaked away down the dark staircase. Once fairly outside, I went off like a lamplighter, and shooting out through the Tudor Street gate, made my way eastward to Broad Street Station, where I was fortunate enough to catch a train that was just on the point of starting. At Hampstead Heath Station I got out, and, snuffing the air joyfully, set forth at my best pace up the slope that leads to the summit, and in little over 20 minutes found myself at the gate of the Hawthorns. There was no need to knock or ring. My approach had been observed from the window, and as I strode up the garden path, the door opened and Sylvia ran out to meet me. "It was nice of you to come," she exclaimed, as I took her hand and held it in mine. "I don't believe you ought to have ventured out, but I'm most delighted all the same. Don't make a noise. Mopsy is having a little doze in the drawing-room. Come into the morning-room and let me have a good look at you." I followed her meekly into the front room, where, in the large bay window, she inspected me critically, her cheeks dimpling with a mischievous smile. "There's something radically wrong about your eyebrows," she said. "But really you are not in the least the fright that you made out. As to the beard and moustache, I'm not sure that I don't rather like them." "I hope you don't," I replied, "because off they come at the first opportunity, unless, of course, you forbid it." "Does my opinion of your appearance matter so much, then?" "It matters entirely. I don't care what I look like to anyone else." "Oh, what a fib!" exclaimed Sylvia. "Don't I remember how very neatly turned out you always were when you used to pass me in the lane before we knew one another?" "Exactly," I retorted. "We didn't know one another then. That makes all the difference in the world, to me at any rate." "Does it?" she said, colouring a little and looking at me thoughtfully. "It's very, very flattering of you to say so, Dr. Jardine." "I hope you didn't mean that as a snub," I said, rather uneasy at the form of her reply and thinking of my letter. "A snub?" she exclaimed. "No, I certainly don't. What did I say?" "You called me Dr. Jardine. I addressed you in my letter as Sylvia, my dear Sylvia." "And what ought I to have said?" she asked, blushing warmly and casting down her eyes. "Well, Sylvia, if you like me as well as I like you, I don't see why you shouldn't call me Humphrey. We're quite old friends now." "So we are," she agreed, "and perhaps it would be less formal. So Humphrey it shall be in future, since that is your royal command. But tell me, how did you prevail on Dr. Thorndyke to let you come here? Is there any change in the situation?" "There is a change in my situation, and a mighty agreeable change, too. I'm here." "Now don't be silly. How did you persuade Dr. Thorndyke to let you come?" "Ha! That, my dear Sylvia, is a rather embarrassing question. Shall we change the subject?" "No, we won't." She looked at me suspiciously for a moment, and then exclaimed in low, tragical tones, "Humphrey! You don't mean to tell me that you came away without his knowledge?" "I'm afraid that is what it amounts to. I saw a loophole and I popped through it, and here I am, as I remarked before." "But how dreadful of you! Perfectly shocking! And whatever will he say to you when you go back?" "That is a question that I am not proposing to present vividly to my consciousness until I arrive on the doorstep. I've broken out of chokey, and I'm going to have a good time. To go on having a good time, I should say." "Then you consider that you're having a good time now?" "I don't consider. I am sure of it. Am I not, at this very moment, looking at you? What more could a man desire?" She tried to look severe, though the attempt was not strikingly successful, and retorted in an admonishing tone, "You needn't try to wheedle me with compliments. You are a very wicked person and most indiscreet. But it seems to me that some sort of change has come over you since you retired from the world. Don't you think I'm right?" "You're perfectly right. I've improved. That's what it is. Matured and mellowed, you know, like a bottle of claret that has been left in its cellar and forgotten. Say you think I've improved, Sylvia." "I won't," she replied, and then, changing her mind, she added, "Yes, I will. I'll say that you are more insinuating than ever, if that will do. And now, as you are clearly quite incorrigible, I won't scold you any more, especially as you broke out of chokey to come and see me. You shall tell me all about your adventures." "I didn't come here to talk about myself, Sylvia. I came to tell you something. Well, about myself, perhaps, but not my adventures, you know, or that sort of thing, but I've been thinking a good deal, since I've been alone so much. About you, I mean, Sylvia. And oh, the deuce!" The latter exclamation was evoked by the warning voice of the gong, evidently announcing tea, and the subsequent appearance of the housemaid, who was certainly not such a goose as she was supposed to be, for she tapped discreetly at the door and waited 3 full seconds before entering, and even then she appeared demurely unconscious of my existence. "If you please, Miss Sylvia, Miss Vyne has woke up and I've taken in the tea." Such was the paltry interruption that arrested the flow of my eloquence and scattered my flowers of rhetoric to the winds. I murmured inwardly, "Blow the tea," for the opportunity was gone, but I comforted myself with the reflection that it didn't matter very much, since Sylvia and I seemed to have arrived at a pretty clear understanding, which understanding was further clarified by a momentary contact of our hands as we followed the maid to the drawing-room. Miss Vyne was on this occasion, as on the last, seated in the exact centre of the room, and with the same monumental effect, so that my thoughts were borne irresistibly to the ethnographical section of the British Museum, and especially to that part of it wherein the deities of Polynesia look out from their cases in perennial surprise at the degenerate European visitors. If she had been asleep previously, she was wide enough awake now, but the glittering eyes were not directed at me. From the moment of our entering the room they focused themselves on Sylvia's face, and there remained riveted, whereby the heightening of that young lady's complexion, which our interview had produced, became markedly accentuated. It was to no purpose that I placed myself before the rigid figure and offered my hand. A paw was lifted automatically to mine, but the eyes remained fixed on Sylvia. "What did you say this gentleman's name was?" the waxwork asked frigidly. "This is Dr. Jardine," was the reply. "Oh, indeed. And who was the gentleman who called some 3 weeks ago?" "Why, that was Dr. Jardine. You know it was." "So I thought, but my memory is not very reliable. And this is a Dr. Jardine too. Very interesting. A medical family, apparently, but not much alike." I was beginning to explain my identity and the cause of my altered appearance when Sylvia approached with a cup of tea and a carefully dissected muffin, which latter she thrust under the nose of the elder lady, who regarded it attentively and with a slight squint, owing to its nearness. "It's of no use, you know," said Sylvia, "for you to pretend that you don't know him, because I've told you all about the transformation. That is, all I know myself. Don't you think it's rather clever make-up?" "If," said Miss Vyne, "by make-up you mean a disguise, I think it is highly successful. The beard is a most admirable imitation." "Oh, the beard is his own, at least I think it is." I confirmed this statement, ignoring Polton's slight additions. "Indeed," said Miss Vyne. "Then the wig, it is a wig, I suppose?" "No, of course it isn't," Sylvia replied. "Then," said Miss Vyne majestically, "perhaps you will explain to me what the disguise consists of." "Well," said Sylvia, "there are the eyebrows. You can see that they have been completely altered in shape." "If I'd committed the former shape of the eyebrows to memory, as you appear to have done," said Miss Vyne, "I should no doubt observe the change. But I did not. It seems to me that the disguise which you told me about with such a flourish of trumpets just amounts to this, that Dr. Jardine has allowed his beard to grow. I find the reality quite disappointing." "Do you?" said Sylvia. "But at any rate you didn't recognize him, so your disappointment doesn't count for much." The old lady, being thus hoist with her own petard, relapsed into majestic silence, and Sylvia then renewed her demand for an account of my adventures. "We want to hear all about that objectionable person who has been shadowing you, and how you finally got rid of him. Your letters were rather sketchy and wanting in detail. You've got to make up the deficiency now." Thus commanded, I plunged into an exhaustive account of those events which I have already chronicled at length, and which I need not refer to again, nor need I record the cross-examination to which I was subjected, since it elicited nothing that is not set forth in the preceding pages. When I had finished my recital, however, Miss Vyne, who had listened to it in silence hitherto, put a question which I had some doubts about answering. "Have you or Dr. Thorndyke been able to discover who this inquisitive person is, and what is his object in following you about?" I hesitated. As to my own experiences, I had no secrets from these friends of mine, excepting those that related to the subject of Thorndyke's investigations, but I must not come here and babble about what took place in the sacred precincts of my principal's chambers. "I think I may tell you," said I, "that Dr. Thorndyke has discovered the identity of this man, and that he is not the person whom we suspected him to be. But I mustn't say any more, as the information came through professional channels, and consequently is not mine to give." "Of course you mustn't," said Sylvia, "though I don't mind admitting that you have put me on tenterhooks of curiosity. But I dare say you will be able to tell us everything later." I agreed that I probably should, and the talk then turned into fresh channels. The short winter day was running out apace. The daylight had long since gone, and I began, with infinite reluctance, to think of returning to my cage. Indeed, when I looked at my watch, I was horrified to see how the time had fled. "My word!" I exclaimed. "I must be off, or Thorndyke will be putting the sleuth-hounds of the law on my track, and I don't know what you will think of me for having stayed such an unconscionable time." "It isn't a ceremonial visit," said Sylvia, as I rose and made my adieu to her aunt. "We should have liked you to stay much longer." Here she paused suddenly, and, clasping her hands, gazed at me with an expression of dismay. "Good heavens! Humphrey!" she exclaimed. "Eh?" said Miss Vyne. "I was addressing Dr. Jardine," Sylvia explained, in some confusion. "I didn't suppose you were addressing me," was the withering reply. "Do you know," said Sylvia, "that I haven't shown you those sketches, after all? You must see them. They were the special object of your visit." This was perfectly untrue, and she knew it, but I did not think it worth while to contest the statement in Miss Vyne's presence. Accordingly, I expressed the utmost eagerness to see the trumpery sketches, and the more so since I had understood that they were on view in the studio, which turned out to be the case. "It won't take a minute for you to see them," said Sylvia. "I'll just run up and light the gas, and you're not to come in until I tell you." She preceded me up the stairs to the little room on the first floor in which she worked, and, when I had waited a few moments on the landing, she summoned me to enter. "These are the sketches," said she, "that I've finished. You see, they are quite presentable now. I cleaned off the rough daubs of paint with a scraper and finished up with a soft rag dipped in chloroform." I ran my eye over the framed sketches, which, now that the canvases were strained on stretchers and the disfiguring brush strokes removed, were, as she had said, quite presentable, though too rough and unfinished to be attractive. "I dare say they are very interesting," said I, "but they are only bare beginnings. I shouldn't have thought them worth framing." "Not as pictures," she agreed, "but as examples of a very curious technique, I find them most instructive. However, you haven't seen the real gem of the collection. This is it, on the easel. Sit down on the chair and say when you are ready. I'm going to give you a surprise." I seated myself on the chair opposite the easel, on which was a canvas with its back towards me. "Now," said Sylvia, "are you ready? 1, 2, 3." She picked up the canvas and, turning it round quickly, presented its face to me. I don't know what I'd expected, if I'd expected anything, but certainly I was not in the least prepared for what I saw. The sketch had originally represented, very roughly, a dark mass of trees which occupied nearly the whole of the canvas, but of this the middle had been cleaned away, exposing an underpainting, and this it was that filled me with such amazement that, after a first startled exclamation, I could do nothing but stare open-mouthed at the canvas, for, from the opening in the dark mass of foliage, there looked out at me, distinct and unmistakable, the face of Mrs. Samway. It was no illusion or chance resemblance. Rough as the painting was, the likeness was excellent. All the well-known features which made her so different from other women were there, though expressed by a mere dexterous turn of the knife. The jet-black, formally parted hair, the clear, bright complexion, the pale, inscrutable eyes, all were there, even to the steady, penetrating expression that looked out at me from the canvas as if in silent recognition. As I sat staring at the picture with a surprise that almost amounted to awe, Sylvia looked at me a little blankly. "Well," she exclaimed at length, "I meant to give you a surprise, but what is it, Humphrey? Do you know her?" "Yes," I replied, "and so do you. Don't you remember a woman who looked in at you through the glass door of Robinson's shop?" "Do you mean that black and scarlet creature? I didn't recognize her. I had no idea she was so handsome, for this is really a very beautiful face, though there is something about it that I don't understand. Something, well, eerie, rather uncanny and almost sinister. Don't you think so?" "I've always thought her a rather weird woman, but this is the weirdest appearance she has made. How on earth came her face on that canvas?" "It is an odd coincidence, and yet I don't know that it is. She may have been some relative of that rather eccentric artist, or even his wife. I don't know why it shouldn't be so." Neither did I, but the coincidence remained a very striking one, to me, at least, much more so than Sylvia realized, though what its significance might be, if it had any, I could not guess. Nor was there any opportunity to discuss it at the moment, for it was high time for me to be gone. "You will send me a telegram when you get back to say that you have arrived home safely, won't you?" said Sylvia, as we descended the stairs with our arms linked together. "Of course nothing's going to happen to you, but I can't help feeling a little nervous. And you'll go down to the station by the High Street and keep to the main roads. That is a promise, isn't it?" I made the promise readily, having decided previously to take every possible precaution, and when I had wished Sylvia good-bye at some length, I proceeded to execute it, making my way down the well-populated High Street and keeping a bright look-out both there and at the station. Once more I was fortunate in the matter of trains, and, having taken a hansom from Broad Street to the Temple, was set down in King's Bench Walk soon after 6:30. As I approached our building, I looked up with some anxiety at the sitting-room windows, and when I saw them brightly lighted, a suspicion that Thorndyke had returned earlier than usual filled me with foreboding. I had had my dance, and now I was going to pay the piper, and I did not much enjoy the prospect. In fact, as I ascended the stairs and took my latchkey from my pocket, I was as nervous as a schoolboy who has been playing truant. However, there was no escape unless I sneaked up to my bedroom. So, inserting the key into the lock, I turned it as boldly as I could and entered. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of A Silent Witness by R. Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 18. A Visitor from the States. As I pushed open the inner door and entered the room, I conceived the momentary hope of a reprieve from the wrath to come, for I found my two friends in what was evidently a business consultation with a stranger, and was on the point of backing out when Thorndyke stopped me. "Don't run away, Howard," said he. "There are no secrets being disclosed. At least, I think not. We have finished with your affairs, Mr. O'Donnell, haven't we?" "Yes, Doctor," was the answer. "You ran me dry with the exception of your own little business." "Then come in and sit down, Howard, and let me present you to Mr. O'Donnell, who is a famous American detective and has been telling us all sorts of wonderful things." Mr. O'Donnell paused in the act of returning a quantity of papers to a large attaché case and offered his hand. "The doctor," he remarked, "is blowing his trumpet at the wrong end. I haven't come here to give information, but to get advice. But I guess I needn't tell you that." "I hope that isn't quite true," said Thorndyke. "You spoke just now of my little business. Haven't you anything to tell me?" "I have, but I fancy it isn't what you wanted to hear. However, we'll just have a look at your letter to Curtis and take your questions one by one. By the way, what made you write to Curtis?" "I saw, when I inspected Maddock's will at Somerset House, that he had left a small legacy to Curtis. Naturally, I inferred that Curtis knew him and could give me some account of him." "It struck you as a bit queer, I reckon, that he should be leaving a legacy to the head of an American detective agency." "The circumstance suggested possibilities," Thorndyke admitted. O'Donnell laughed. "I can guess what possibilities suggested themselves to you if you knew Maddock. Your letter and the lawyer's, announcing the legacy, came within a mail or two of one another. Curtis showed them both to me, and we grinned. We took it for granted that that worthy testator was foxing, but we were wrong. So are you, if that's what you thought." "You assumed that the will was not a genuine one?" "Yeah, we thought it was a fake, put up with the aid of some shyster to bluff us into giving up Mr. Maddock as deceased. So as I had to come across about these other affairs, Curtis suggested that I should look into the matter. And a considerable surprise I got when I did, for the will is perfectly regular, and so is everything else. That legacy was a sort of posthumous joke, I guess." "Then do I understand that Mr. Curtis was not really a friend of Maddock's?" O'Donnell chuckled. "Not exactly a friend, Doctor," said he. "He felt the warmest interest in Maddock's welfare, but they weren't what you might call bosom friends. The position was this: Curtis was the chief of our detective agency." Maddock was a gentleman whom he'd been looking for and not finding for a matter of 10 years. At last he found him, and then lost him again. And this legacy, I take it, was a sort of playful hint to show which hole he'd gone down." "Was Maddock in hiding all that time?" asked Thorndyke. "In hiding?" repeated O'Donnell. "Bless your innocent heart, Doctor, he had a nice convenient studio in one of the best blocks in New York, a couple of doors from our agency, and he used to send us cards for his private views. And no, sir, our departed friend wasn't the kind that lurks out of sight in cellars or garrets. It was Maddock, sure enough, that Curtis wanted, only he didn't know it. But I guess I'm fogging you. I'd best answer the questions that you put to Curtis. First, do we know anything about Maddock? Yes, we do, but we didn't know that his name was Maddock until a few months ago. Isaac Van Dam was the name we knew him by, and it seems that he had one or two other names that he used on occasion. We now know that the gay Isaac was a particularly versatile kind of crook, and a mighty uncommon kind, too. The Lord be praised, for if there were many more like him, we should have to raise our prices some. He wasn't the kind of fool that make $1,000,000 coup and then goes on the razzle and drops it all. That sort of man is easy enough to deal with. When he's loaded up with dollars, everybody knows it, and he's sure to be back in a week or two with empty pockets, ready for another scoop. Isaac wasn't that sort. When he made a little pile, he invested his winnings like a sensible man, and didn't live beyond his means. And the only mystery to me is that, when he died, he didn't leave more pickings. I see from his will, which I've had a look at, that the whole estate couldn't have been above $5,000. He had a lot more than that at one time." "He may have disposed of the bulk of his property by gift just before his death," Jervis suggested. "That's possible," agreed O'Donnell. "He'd escaped the death dues that way. However, to return to his engaging little ways, his leading line was penmanship, forgery, and he did it to an absolute finish. He was the most expert penman that I've ever known. But where he had us all was that he didn't only know how to write another man's name, he knew when to write it. I reckon that the great bulk of his forgeries were never spotted at all, and of the remainder very few got beyond the bare suspicion that they were forgeries. In the case of the few that were actually spotted as forgeries, his tracks were covered up so cleverly that no one could guess who the forger was." "And how did you come to suspect him, eventually?" Thorndyke asked. "Ah," said O'Donnell, "there you are. Every crook, even the cleverest, has a strain of the fool in him. Isaac's folly took the form of suspicion. He suspected us of suspecting him. We didn't, but he thought we did, and then he started to dodge and make some false clues for us. That drew our attention to him. We looked into his record, traced his little wanderings, and then we began to find things out. A nice collection there was, too, by the time we'd worked a month or two at his biography. Forgeries, false notes, and at least 2 murders that had been a complete mystery to us all. We made ready to drop on Isaac, but at that psychological moment he disappeared. It looked as if he had left the States, and, as we have no great affection for extradition cases, we let the matter rest, more or less, expecting that he would turn up again sooner or later. And then came this lawyer's letter, and yours, announcing his decease. Of course, Curtis and I thought he was the old game, that it was a bit of that sort of extra caution that won't let well alone. So as I was coming over, I thought I'd just look into the affair as I told you. And to my astonishment, I found everything perfectly regular, the will properly proved, the death certificate made out correctly, and a second certificate signed by 2 doctors." "Did you go into the question of identity?" asked Thorndyke. "Oh, yes. I called on one of the doctors, a man named Batson, and ascertained that it was all correct. Batson's eyesight seemed to be none of the best, but he made it quite clear to me that his late patient was certainly our friend Isaac, or Maddock. So that's the end of the case. And if you want to go into it any further, you've got to deal with a little pile of bone ash, for our friend is not only dead, he's cremated. That's enough for us. We don't follow our clients to the next world. We are not so thorough as you seem to be." "You are flattering me unduly," said Thorndyke. "I'm not so thorough as that. But our clients, when they betake themselves to the happy hunting ground, usually leave a few of their friends behind to continue their activities. Do you happen to know what Maddock's original occupation was? Had he any profession?" "He was originally an engraver, and a very skilful engraver too, I understand. That was what made him so handy in working the flash note racket. Then he went on the stage for a time, and didn't do badly at that. But I fancy he was more clever at making up and mimicry than at acting in the dramatic sense. For the last 10 years or so he was practising as a painter, chiefly of landscape, though he could do a figure subject or a portrait at a pinch. I don't fancy he sold much, or made any great efforts to sell his work. He liked painting, and the art covered his real industries, for he used to tour about in search of subjects, and so open up fresh ground for the little operations that actually produced his income. Was his work of any considerable merit? Thorndyke asked. Well, in a way, yes. It was rather in the American taste, though Maddock was really an Englishman. Our taste, as you know, runs to technical smartness and novelty of handling, and Maddock's work was very peculiar, and remarkably smart and slick in handling. He used the knife more than the brush, and he used it uncommonly cleverly. In fact, he was unusually skilful in many ways, and that's the really surprising thing about him, when one considers his extraordinary-looking paws. What was there peculiar about his hands? Asked Thorndyke. Were they noticeably clumsy in appearance? Clumsy! Exclaimed O'Donnell. They were more than that. They were positively deformed. A monkey's hands would be delicate compared with Maddock's. They were short and thick like the paws of an animal. There's some jaw-twisting name for the deformity that he suffered from. Bronchodactylus or something like that. Brachydactylus, suggested Thorndyke. That's the word, and I dare say you know the sort of paw I mean. It didn't look a very likely hand for a first-class penman and engraver of flash notes, but you can't always judge by appearances. And now as to your other questions, you ask what Maddock was like in appearance. I can only give you the description which I gave to Batson, and which he recognized at once. Had he noticed the peculiarity of the hands? Inquired Thorndyke. Yeah, I asked him about it, and he remembered having observed it when he was attending Maddock. Well then, our friend was about 5'9" in height, fairly broad and decidedly strong, of a medium complexion with grey eyes and darkish brown hair. That's all I can tell you about him. You haven't got his fingerprints, I suppose? No, he was never in prison, so we had no chance of getting them. Was he married? He had been, but some years ago his wife divorced him, or he divorced her. Latterly he has lived as a bachelor. There is nothing else that you can think of as throwing light on his personality, or explaining his actions? Nothing at all, Doctor. I've told you all I know about him, and I only hope the information may be more useful than it looks to me. Thank you, said Thorndyke. Your information is not only useful, I expect to find it quite valuable. Reasoning, you know, Mr. O'Donnell, he continued, is somewhat like building an arch. On a supporting mould, the builder lays a number of shaped stones or voussoirs. But until all the voussoirs are there, it is a mere collection of stones, incapable of bearing its own weight. Then you drop the last voussoir, the keystone, into its place, and the arch is complete. And now you may take away the supports, for it will not only bear its own weight, but carry a heavy superstructure. That's so, Doctor, said O'Donnell. But if I may ask, is this all gratuitous wisdom, or has any particular bearing? It has this bearing, replied Thorndyke. I have myself been, for some time past, engaged, metaphorically, in the building of an arch. When you came here tonight, it was but a collection of shaped and adjusted stones, supported from without. With your kind aid, I have just dropped the keystone into its place. That is what I mean. The American thoughtfully arranged the papers in his case, casting an occasional speculative glance at Thorndyke. I'd like to know, he said presently, what it was that I told you. It doesn't seem to me that I've produced any startling novelties. However, I know it's no use trying to squeeze you, so I'll get back to my hotel and have a chew at what you've told me. He shook hands with us all round, and, when Thorndyke had let him out, we heard him bustling downstairs and away up King's Bench Walk towards Mitre Court. For a minute or more after his departure none of us spoke. Thorndyke was apparently ruminating on his newly acquired information, and Jervis and I on the statement that had so naturally aroused the detective's curiosity. At length Jervis opened the inevitable debate. "I begin to see a glimmer of daylight through the case of Septimus Maddock, deceased," said he. "But it is only a glimmer. whereas from what you said to O'Donnell, I gather that you have the case quite complete." "Hardly that, Jervis," was the reply. "I spoke metaphorically, and metaphors are sometimes misleading. Perhaps I overstated the case. So we will drop metaphor and state the position literally in terms of good, plain, schoolboy logic. It is this. We had certain facts presented to us in connection with Maddox's death. For instance, we observed that the cause of death was obscure, that the body was utterly destroyed by cremation, and that Jardine, who was an unofficial witness to some of the formalities, was subsequently pursued by some unknown person with the unmistakable purpose of murdering him. Those were some of the observed facts, and the explanation of those facts was the problem submitted to us. That is to say, we had to connect those facts and supply others by deduction and research, so that they should form a coherent and intelligible sequence, of which the motive for murdering Jardine should form a part. Having observed and examined our facts, we next propose a hypothesis which shall explain them. In this case, it would naturally take the form of a hypothetical reconstruction of the circumstances of Maddox's death. That hypothesis must, of course, be in complete agreement with all the facts known to us, including the attempts to murder Jardine. Then, having invented a hypothesis which fits our facts completely, the next stage is to verify it. If the circumstances of Maddox's death were such as we have assumed, certain antecedent events must have occurred, and certain conditions must have existed. We make the necessary inquiries and investigations, and we find that those events had actually occurred, and those conditions had actually existed. Then it is probable that our hypothesis is correct, particularly if our researches have brought to light nothing that disagrees with it. With our new facts we can probably amplify our hypothesis, reconstruct it in greater detail, and then we have to test and verify it afresh in its amplified and detailed form. And if such new tests still yield an affirmative result, the confirmation of the hypothesis becomes overwhelmingly strong. It is, however, still only hypothesis. But perhaps we light on some final test which is capable of yielding a definite answer, yes or no. If we apply that test, the crucial experiment of the logicians, and obtain an affirmative result, our inquiry is at an end. It has passed out of the region of hypothesis into that of demonstrative proof." "And are we to understand," asked Jervis, "that you have brought Maddox's case to the stage of complete demonstration?" "No," answered Thorndyke. "I am still in the stage of hypothesis, and when O'Donnell came here tonight there were 2 points which I had been unable to verify. But with his aid I have been able to verify them both, and I now have a complete hypothesis of the case which has been tested exhaustively and has answered to every test. All that remains to be done is to apply the touchstone of the final experiment." "I suppose," said Jervis, "you've obtained a good many new facts in the course of your investigations?" "Not a great many," replied Thorndyke, "and what new data I have obtained I have, for the most part, communicated to you and Jardine. I assure you, Jervis, that if you would only concentrate your attention on the case, you have ample material for a most convincing and complete elucidation of it." Jervis looked at me with a wry smile. "Now, Howard," said he, "why don't you brush up your wits and tell us exactly what happened to the late Mr. Maddock, and why some person unknown is so keen on your vile body? You have all the facts, you know." "So you tell me," I retorted, "but this case of yours reminds me of those elaborate picture puzzles that used to weary my juvenile brain. You had a hatful of irregular shaped pieces which, if you fitted them together, made a picture, only the beggars wouldn't fit together." "A very apt comparison," said Thorndyke. "You put the pieces together, and, if they made no intelligible part of a picture, you knew you were wrong, no matter how well they seemed to fit. On the other hand, if they seemed to make parts of a picture, you had to verify the result by finding pieces of the exact shape and size of the empty spaces. That is what I have been doing in this case, trying the data together and watching to see if they made the expected picture. As I have told you, O'Donnell's visit found me with the picture entire, save for 2 empty spaces of a particular shape and size, and from him I obtained 2 pieces that dropped neatly into those spaces and made the picture complete. All I have to do now is to see if the picture is a true representation or only a consistent work of imagination. I take it that you've worked the case out in pretty full detail, said Jervis. Yes. If the final verification is successful, I shall be able to tell you exactly what happened in Maddock's house, what was the cause of death, and I may say that it was not that given in the certificates, who the person is who has been pursuing Jardine and what is his motive, together with a number of other very curious items of information. And the mention of that person reminds me that our friend has been disporting himself in public, contrary to advice and to what I thought was a definite understanding. But surely, I said, it doesn't matter now. We've given that spy chappie the slip, and even if he hasn't given up the chase as hopeless, we know that he's quite harmless. Harmless? Exclaimed Thorndyke. Why, my dear fellow, he was your guardian angel. Didn't you realize that from Father Humperdinck's statement? He shadowed you so closely that no attack on you was possible. In fact, he actually caught a rap on the head that was apparently meant for you. You were infinitely safer with him at your heels than alone. But we've given the other fellow the slip too, I urged. We mustn't take that for granted, said Thorndyke. The French detective, you remember, came on the scene quite recently, whereas the other man has been with us from the beginning. He probably saw Jervis and me enter the mineral water works on the night of the fire, for he was certainly there, and he may even have followed us home to ascertain who we were. There are several ways in which he could have connected you with us and traced you here. So I must urge you most strongly not to venture out of the precincts of the temple for the next few days. In fact, it will be much wiser to keep indoors altogether. It will be only a matter of days, unless I get a quite unexpected setback, for I hope to have the case finally completed in less than a week. And when I do, I shall take such action as will give your friend some occupation other than shadowing you. Very well, I said. I will promise not to attempt again to escape from custody. But all the same, my little jaunt today has not been entirely without result. I've picked up a new fact, and a rather curious one, I think. What should you say if I suggested that Mrs. Samway was the wife of that eccentric artist who used to paint on the Heath? The man, I mean, who always worked in gloves. I have assumed that she was in some such relation to him, replied Thorndyke, but I should like to hear the evidence. Mrs. Samway, Jervis said in a reflective tone, isn't that the handsome, uncanny-looking lady with the mongoose eyes who reminded me of Lucrezia Borgia? That's the lady. Well, I met with a portrait of her today, which was evidently the work of the man with the gloves. And here I gave them a description of the portrait and an account of the odd way in which it had been disinterred from the landscape that had been painted over it, to which they both listened with close attention. It's a queer incident, said Thorndyke, and quite dramatic. If one were inclined to be superstitious, one might imagine some invisible agency uncovering the tracks that have been so carefully hidden and working unseen in the interests of justice. But haven't you rather jumped to your conclusion? The existence of the portrait establishes a connection, but not necessarily that of husband and wife. I only suggested the relationship, but it seemed a likely one, as the portrait had been painted over and thrown into the rubbish box. Jervis laughed sardonically, and even Thorndyke's impassive face relaxed into a smile. "Our young friend," said the former, "doesn't take as favourable a view of the married state as one might expect from a gay Lothario who breaks out of his cage to go a philandering. But we'll overlook that, in consideration of the very interesting information that he's brought back with him. Not that it conveys very much to me. It is obviously a new piece to fit into our puzzle, but I'm hanged if I see, at the moment, any suitable space to drop it into." "I think," said Thorndyke, "that if you consider the picture as a whole, you'll soon find a vacant space, and while you are considering it, I will just send off a letter, and then we'd better adjourn this discussion. We have to catch the early train to Maidstone tomorrow, and that, I hope, will be the last time. Our case ought to be disposed of by the afternoon." He seated himself at the writing table and wrote his letter, while Jervis stared into the fire with a cogitative frown. When the letter was sealed and addressed, Thorndyke laid it on the table, while he went to the lobby to put on his hat and coat, and, glancing at it almost unconsciously, I noted that the envelope was of foolscap size and was addressed to the Home Office, Whitehall. The name of the addressee escaped me, for, suddenly realizing the impropriety of thus inspecting another man's letter, I looked away hastily. But even then, when Thorndyke had taken it away to the post, I found myself speculating vaguely on the nature of the communication, and wondering if it had any relation to the mysterious and intricate case of Septimus Maddock. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of A Silent Witness by R. Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 19. Tenebrae. The resigned composure with which I accepted Thorndyke's sentence of confinement within doors was not entirely attributable to discretion or native virtue. My resolution to follow scrupulously my principal's very pointed advice was somewhat like the ascetic resolutions formed by the gourmet as he rises replete from the banquet table. For, just as the latter is in a peculiarly favourable condition for the unmoved contemplation of a temporary abstinence from food, so I, having enjoyed my little dissipation, could now contemplate with fortitude a brief period of retirement. Moreover, the weather was in my favour, being, as Polton reported when he returned, blue-nosed and powdered with snow, with a fresh supply of tobacco for me, bitterly cold, with a threatening of smoky fog from the east. Under these circumstances it was no great hardship to sit in a roomy armchair with my slippered feet on the curb and read and meditate as I basked in the warmth of a glowing fire, though, to be sure, my reading was perfunctory enough, for the treatise of The Surface Markings of the Human Body, admirable as it was, competed on very unfavourable terms with other claimants to my attention. In truth, I had plenty to think about, even if I went no farther for matter than to the events of the previous day. There was my visit to Sylvia, for instance. I had not said much to her, but what I had said had pledged me to a lifelong companionship, which was a solemn thing to reflect upon, even though I looked forward to the fulfilment of that pledge with nothing but hopeful pleasure. The dice were thrown. Of course they would turn up sixes, every one. But still, the dice were thrown. From my own strictly personal affairs my thoughts rambled by an easy transition to the singular episode of the buried portrait, and thence to the subject of that strange palimpsest. Viewed by the light of Mr. O'Donnell's revelations, Mrs. Samway's position was not all that could have been desired. She and her husband had unquestionably been closely associated with Maddock, but Maddock was, it seemed, a habitual criminal. Could this fact have been known to the Samways, or was it that the cunning forger and swindler had sheltered himself behind their respectability? It was impossible for me to say. Then there was the strange and perplexing case of the man Maddock himself. I could make nothing of that, had not indeed been aware that there had been a case until Thorndyke's investigations had put me in possession of the fact. And even now I could see nothing on which to base any suspicion, apart from the attempts on my life, which we were assuming to be in some way connected with events that had occurred in Maddock's house. The cause of death was apparently not morbus cordis, which might easily enough be, seeing that the diagnosis of heart disease was a mere guess on Batson's part. But if not morbus cordis, what was it? Thorndyke apparently knew, and seemed to hint that it was something other than ordinary disease. Could there have been foul play? And if so, were the Samways involved in it in any way? It seemed incredible, for had not Maddock himself suspected that he was in a dangerous state of health? There was certainly one possibility which I considered with a good deal of distaste, namely, that Maddock had been in a hypochondriacal state, and that the Samways had taken advantage of his gloomy views as to his health to administer poison. The thing was actually possible, but I did not entertain it, for, even if one assumed that poison had been administered, at any rate the cremation of the body was not designed to hide the traces of the crime. The Samways had nothing to do with that. The cremation had been adopted, in preference to burial, by Maddock's own wish. So my thoughts flitted from topic to topic, with occasional interludes of service markings, through the lazy forenoon until Polton came to lay my solitary luncheon. And after this little break in the comfortable monotony, another spell of meditative idleness set in. Polton was busy upstairs in the laboratory with some photographic copying operations, and I was disposed to wander up and look on, but my small friend politely but very firmly vetoed any such proceeding. On some other occasion he would be delighted to show me the working of the great copying camera, but just now he had a big job in hand, and, as he was working against time, he would prefer to be alone. He even suggested that I might attend to any stray callers and make my own tea on the gas ring, so as to avoid interrupting his work. And when I had agreed to relieve him to this extent, he thanked me profusely and retired, and I saw no more of him. For some time after his departure, I stood at the window looking out across the white space at Paper Buildings and the end of Crown Office Bow. It was a wretched afternoon. The yellow, turbid sky brooded close down upon the house roofs and grew darker and more brown moment by moment, as if the invisible sun had given the day up in despair and gone home early. A comfortless powdering of snow filtered down at intervals and melted on the pavements, along which depressed wayfarers hurried with their coat collars turned up and their hands thrust deep into their pockets. I watched them commiseratingly, reflecting the superior advantages of being within doors and forbidden to go out; and then, having flung another scoopful of coal on the fire, I betook myself once more to the armchair, the service markings, and idle meditation. It was some time past 4 when my reflective browsings had begun to proceed in the direction of the tea kettle, that I heard a light footstep on the landing as of some one wearing goloshes. Then a letter dropped softly into the box, and, as I instantly pushed back my chair to rise, the footsteps retreated. I crossed the room quickly and opened the door, but the messenger had already disappeared down the dark staircase, and had gone so silently on his rubber soles that, though I listened attentively, I could hear no sound from below. Having closed the door, I extracted the letter from the box and took it over to the window to examine it, when I was not a little surprised to find that it was addressed to W. M. Howard, Esq. This was the first communication that I had received in my borrowed name, and my surprise at its arrival was not unreasonable, for, of the few persons who knew me by that name, none, with the exception perhaps of Mr. Marchmont, was in the least likely to write to me. But if the address on the envelope had surprised me, the letter itself surprised me a good deal more, for though the writer was quite unknown to me, even by name, he seemed to be in possession of certain information concerning me, which I had supposed to be the exclusive property of Thorndyke, Jervis, Polton, and myself. It bore the address 29 Fig Tree Court, Inner Temple, and ran thus: Dear Sir, I am taking the liberty of writing to you to ask for your assistance, as I happen to know that my friends, Doctors Thorndyke and Jervis, are away at Maidstone and not available at the moment, and I understand that you have some acquaintance with medical technicalities. The circumstances are these. At 5:30 today I shall be meeting a solicitor to advise as to action in respect of a case in which I am retained, and the decision as to our action will be vitally affected by a certain issue on which I am not competent to form an opinion for lack of medical knowledge. If Dr. Thorndyke had been within reach, I should have taken his opinion. As he is not, it occurred to me to ask if you would fill his place on this occasion, it being of course understood that the usual fee of 5 guineas will be paid by the solicitor. If you should be unable to come to the consultation, do not trouble to reply, as I am now going out and shall not be returning until 5:30, the time of the appointment. I am, yours faithfully, Arthur Courtland. The contents of this letter, as I have said, surprised me more than a little. How, in the name of all that was wonderful, had this stranger, whose very name was unknown to me, come to be aware that I had any knowledge of medicine? Not from Thorndyke, I felt perfectly sure, nor from Jervis, who, notwithstanding a certain flippant facetiousness of manner, was really an extremely cautious and judicious man. Could it be that my principal was overseen in his trusted laboratory assistant? Was it conceivable that the suave and discreet Polton had moments of leakiness, when, in unofficial talk outside, he let drop the secrets of which his employer's unbounded confidence had made him the repository? I could not believe it. Not only did Polton appear to be the very soul of discretion, there was Thorndyke himself. He was not the man to give his confidence to anyone until after the most exhaustive proof of the safety of so giving it. Nor was he a man who was likely to be deceived, for nothing escaped his observation, and nothing that he observed was passed over without careful consideration. My lethargy having been shaken off, I addressed myself to the task of preparing tea, and, as I listened to the homely crescendo of the kettle's song, I turned the matter over in all its bearings. By some means this Mr. Courtland had become aware that I was either a doctor or a medical student. But by what means? Was it possible that he had merely inferred from the circumstance of my being associated with Thorndyke that I was of the same profession? That was just barely conceivable, but if he had, then, as Jervis had said of Father Humperdinck, he must be a devil at guessing. As I made the tea and subsequently consumed it, I continued to ruminate on the contents of that singular letter. No answer to it was required. Then what was Mr. Courtland going to do if I did not turn up? He admitted that the issue, which seemed to be an important one, was beyond him, and yet he had to give an answer to the solicitor. And he was prepared to pay 5 guineas for the advice of a man of whom he, presumably, knew nothing. That was odd. In fact, the whole tone of the letter, with its inconsistent mixture of urgency and casual trusting to chance, seemed irreconcilable with the care and method that one expects from a professional man. And there was another point. The time of the consultation was 5:30. Now, within an hour of that time, Thorndyke would be back, or even sooner if he came by the earlier train as he had done on the previous day. And Mr. Courtland must have known, since he knew whither my principal had gone, and he must have often attended assizes himself. Could he not have waited an hour? And again, had this business been sprung upon him so suddenly that he had had no time to get Thorndyke's opinion? And, yet again, why had he written at all, instead of dropping in at our chambers with the solicitor, as was so commonly done by Thorndyke's clients? All of which were curious and puzzling questions which I put to myself one by one and had to dismiss unanswered. And then I came to the practical question, to which I had to find an answer, and which was, could I, under the existing circumstances, accede to Mr. Courtland's request? To go outside the precincts of the inn was, I recognized, absolutely forbidden, but I had given no actual promise to remain in our chambers, nor had I been positively forbidden to leave them. Thorndyke had advised me to remain indoors, and his advice had been given so pointedly and with so evident a desire that it should be followed, that I had not hitherto even thought of leaving our premises. But this was an unforeseen contingency, and the question was, did it alter my position in regard to Thorndyke's advice? I think I have never been so undecided in my life. On the one hand, I was strongly tempted to keep the appointment. The prospect of triumphantly handing to Thorndyke a 5-guinea fee which I had earned as his deputy appealed to me with almost irresistible force. On the other hand, my knowledge of Thorndyke did not support this appeal. I knew him to be a man to whom a principle was much more important than any chance benefit gained by its abandonment, and my inner consciousness told me that he would be better pleased by a strict adherence to our understanding than by the increment of 5 guineas. So my thoughts oscillated to and fro, now impelling me to risk it and earn the fee, and now urging me to keep to the letter of my instructions; and meanwhile the time ran on and the hour of the consultation approached. What decision I should have reached in the end it is impossible to say. As matters turned out, I never reached any decision at all, for, just as the Treasury clock struck 5:15, I heard a light, quick step on our landing, and immediately after a soft but hurried knock at the door. I strode quickly across the room and threw the door open. And then I started back with an exclamation of astonishment, for the visitor, who stood full in the light of the landing lamp, was a woman, and the woman was Mrs. Samway. As I stood gazing at her in amazement, she slipped past me into the room and softly shut the door. And then I saw very plainly that there was something amiss, for she was as pale as death and had a dreadful, frightened, hunted look which haunts me even now as I write. She was somewhat dishevelled, too, and, though it was a bitter evening, her plump, shapely hands were ungloved and cold as ice, as I noted when I took them in mine. "Are you alone?" she asked, peering uneasily at the door of the little office. "Yes, quite alone," I replied. She gazed at me with those strange, penetrating eyes of hers, and said in a half whisper: "How strange you look with that beard! I should hardly have known you if I had not expected—" She stopped short, and, casting a strange, scared glance over her shoulder at the dark windows, whispered: "Can they see in? Can anyone see us from outside?" "I shouldn't think so," I replied; but nevertheless I stepped over to the windows and drew the curtains. "That looks more comfortable, at any rate," said I. "And now tell me how in the name of wonder you knew I was here." She grasped both my wrists and looked earnestly, almost fiercely, into my eyes. "Ask me no questions!" she exclaimed. "Ask me nothing. But listen. I have come here for a purpose. Has a letter been left here for you?" "Yes," I replied. "Asking you to go to a place in Fig Tree Court?" "Good God!" I exclaimed. "How on earth—" She shook my wrists impatiently in her strong grasp. "Answer me!" she exclaimed. "Answer me!" "Yes," I replied. "I was to go there at 5:30." Again her strong grasp tightened on my wrists. "Humphrey," she said in a low, earnest voice, "you are not to go. Do you hear me? You are not to go." And then, as I seemed to hesitate, she continued more urgently: "I ask you, I beg you to promise me that you won't." I gazed at her in sheer amazement, but some instinct, some faint glimmer of understanding, restrained me from asking for any explanation. "Very well," I said. "I won't go if you say I'm not to." "That is a promise?" "Yes, it's a promise. Besides, it's nearly past already, so if I don't go now, the appointment falls through." "And you won't go outside these rooms to-night? Promise me that, too." "If I don't go to this lawyer, I shan't go out at all." "And to-morrow, too? Give me your word that you won't let any sort of pretext draw you out of these rooms to-morrow, or the next day, or, in fact, until Dr. Thorndyke says you may." For a few moments I was literally struck dumb with astonishment at her last words, and could do nothing but gaze at her in astounded silence. At length, recovering myself a little, I exclaimed: "My dear Mrs. Samway—" But she interrupted me. "Don't call me by that horrible name. Give me my own name, Letitia. Or," she added, a little shyly and in a soft, coaxing tone, "call me Letty. Won't you, Humphrey, just for this once? You needn't mind. You wouldn't if you knew. I should like, when I think of my friend, the only friend that I care for, to remember that he called me by my own name when he said good-bye. You'll think me silly and sentimental, but you needn't mind indulging me just once. It's the last time." "The last time?" I repeated. "What do you mean by that, Letty, and by speaking of our saying good-bye? Are you going away?" "Yes, I am going away. I don't suppose you will ever see me again. I'm going out of your life." "Not out of my life, Letty. We're always friends, even if we never see one another." "Are we?" she said, looking up at me earnestly. "Perhaps it is so, but still, this is good-bye. I ought to say it and go, but, oh God!" she exclaimed with sudden passion, "I don't want to go, away from you, Humphrey, out into the cold and the dark." She buried her face against my shoulder, and I could feel that she was sobbing, though she uttered no sound. It was a dreadful situation. Instinctively certain though I was that her grief had a real and tragic basis, I could offer no word of comfort. For what was there to say? She was going, clearly, to a life of wretchedness, without hope of any relief or change, and without a single friend to cheer her loneliness. That much I could guess, vaguely and dimly. But it was enough. And it wrung my heart to witness her passion of grief, and to be able to offer no more than a pressure of the hand. After a few seconds she raised her head and looked in my face, with the tears still clinging to her lashes. "Humphrey," she said, laying her hands on my shoulders, "I have a few last words to say to you, and then I must go. Listen to me, dearest friend, and remember what I say. When I am gone, people will tell you things, and you will come to know others. People will say that I am a wicked woman, which is true enough, God knows. But if they say that I have done or connived at wickedness against you, try to believe that it was not as it seemed, and to forgive me for what I have done amiss. And say to yourself, this wicked woman would have willingly given her heart's blood for me. Say that, Humphrey. It is true. I would gladly give my life to make you safe and happy. And try to think kindly of me in the evil report that will reach you sooner or later. Will you try, Humphrey?" "My dear Letty," I said, "we are friends, now and always. Nothing that I hear shall alter that." "I believe you," she said, "and I thank you from my heart. And now I must go. I must go. And it's good-bye. Good-bye, Humphrey, for the very last time." She passed her arms around my neck and pressed her wet cheek to mine. Then she kissed me, and, turning away abruptly, walked across to the door and opened it. On the landing, in the light of the lamp, she turned once more, and I saw that the hot blush that had risen to her cheek as she kissed me had faded already into a deathly pallor, and that the dreadful, frightened, hunted look had come back into her face. She stood for a moment with her finger raised warningly, and whispered, "Good-bye, dear, good-bye. Shut the door now, and shut it quietly." And then she passed into the opening of the dark staircase. I closed the door softly and turned away towards the window, and, as I did so, I heard her stumble slightly on the stair a short way down, and utter a little startled cry. I was nearly going out to her, and did, in fact, stand a moment or two listening, but, as I heard nothing more, I moved over to the window, and, drawing back the curtain, looked down on our doorstep to see her go out. My mind was in a whirl of confused emotions. Profound pity for this lonely, unhappy, warm-hearted woman, contended with amazement at the revelation of her manifest connection with the mystery that surrounded me, and I stood bewildered by the tumult of incoherent thought, grasping the curtain and looking down on the great square stone that I might, at least, catch a farewell glance at this poor soul who was passing so unwillingly out of my life. The seconds passed. A man came out of our entry and, turning to the left, walked at a rapid pace towards the Tudor Street gate. Still she did not appear. Perhaps she had heard him on the stairs and was waiting to pass out unnoticed. But yet it was strange. Nearly a minute had elapsed since she started to descend the stairs. Could I have missed her? It seemed impossible, since I had come to the window almost immediately. A vague uneasiness began to take possession of me. I recalled her white face and frightened eyes, and as I stared down at the doorstep with growing anxiety, I found myself listening nervously for I knew not what. Suddenly I caught a sound, faint and vague, but certainly a sound, and it seemed to come from the staircase. In a moment I had the door open and was stealing on tiptoe out on the landing. The house was profoundly silent. No murmur even penetrated from the distant streets. I crept across the landing, breathing softly and listening. And then, from the stillness below, but near at hand, came a faint, whispering sigh or moan. Instantly I sprang forward, all of a tremble, and darted down the stairs. At the first turn I saw, projecting round the angle, a hand, a woman's hand, plump and shapely and white as marble. With a gasp of terror I flew round the turn of the staircase and God in heaven! She was there, huddled limply in the angle, her head resting against the baluster, and one hand spread out on her bosom. She lay so still that she might have been dead, but for the shallow rise and fall of her breast, and the wide staring eyes that turned to me with such dreadful appeal. I stooped over her and spoke her name, and it seemed to me that a pitiful little smile trembled for a moment on the bloodless lips, but she made no answer beyond a faint, broken sigh, and it was only when she moved her hand slightly that the overwhelming horror of the reality burst upon me. Then, when I saw the crimson stain upon her fingers and upon the bosom of her dress, the meaning of that horrible pallor, the sharpening features and strange, pinched expression flashed upon me with a shock that seemed to arrest the very blood at my heart. Yet, stunned as I was, I realized instantly that human skill could avail her nothing, that I could do naught for her but raise her from the sharp edge of the stair and rest her head on my arm. And so I held her, whispering endearments brokenly, and looking as well as I might through the blinding tears into those inscrutable eyes that gazed up at me, no longer with that stare of horror, but with a vague and childlike wonder. And, even as I looked, the change came in an instant. The wide eyelids relaxed and drooped, the eyes grew filmy and sightless, the hand slipped from her breast and dropped with a thud on the stair, and the supple body in my arms shrank of a sudden with the horrible limpness of death. Up to this point my recollection is clear, even vivid, but of what followed I have only a dim and confused impression. The awfulness, the unbelievable horror of this frightful thing that had happened left me so dazed and numb that I recall but vaguely the passage of time of what went on around me in this terrible dream from which there was to be no waking. Dimly I recollect kneeling by her side on the silent staircase, but how long I know not, holding her poor body in my arms and gazing incredulously at the marble white face, now with its drowsy lids and parted lips grown suddenly girlish and fragile, while the hot tears dropped down on her dress, choking with grief and horror and a fury of hate for the foul wretch who had done this appalling thing, and who was now far away out of reach. I see, dimly still, the livid marks of her cursed fingers lingering yet on the whiteness around the mouth, to tell me why no cry from her had reached me, and the dreadful red-edged cut in the bodice mutely demanding vengeance from God and man. And then of a sudden the silence is shattered by rushing feet and the clamour of voices. Someone, it is Jervis, leads me forcibly away to our room and places me in a chair by the table. Presently I see her lying on our sofa, drowsy-eyed, peaceful, like a marble figure on a tomb, and I see Thorndyke with a strange, coppery flush and something grim and terrible in the set calm of his face, showing the letter, which I had left on the table, to a tall stranger who hurries from the room. Anon come two constables with heads uncovered, carrying a stretcher. I see her laid on the sordid bier and reverently covered. The dread procession moves out through the doorway, the door is shut after it, and so, in dreadful fulfilment of her words, she passed out of my life. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of A Silent Witness by R. Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 20. The Hue and Cry. The silence of the room remained unbroken for a quite considerable time after the two bearers had passed out with that dreadful burden. My two friends sat apart and, with a tact of which I was gratefully sensible, left me quietly undisturbed by banal words of consolation to sustain the first shock of grief and horror and get my emotion under control. Still dazed and half incredulous, I sat with my elbows on the table and my teeth clenched hard, looking dreamily across the room, half unconsciously observing my two friends as they silently examined the fatal letter. I saw Thorndyke rise softly and take a small bottle from a cabinet, and watched him incuriously as he sprinkled on the paper some of the dark-coloured powder that it contained. Then I saw him blow the powder from the surface of the paper into the fire, and scan the letter closely through a lens. And still no word was spoken. Only once, when Jervis, in crossing the room, let his hand rest for a moment on my shoulder, did any communication pass between us. And that silent touch told me unobtrusively, if it were needful to tell me, how well he understood my grief for the woman who had walked open-eyed into the valley of the shadow, had offered her heart's blood that I might pass unscathed. In about a quarter of an hour the tall stranger returned, bringing with him an atmosphere of bustling activity that at once dispelled the gloomy silence. His busy presence and brisk, matter-of-fact speech, though distressing to me at the moment, served as a distraction and brought me out of my painful reverie to the grim realities of this appalling catastrophe. "You are quite right, sir," said he. "The chambers were an empty set. Mr. Cortlandt left them about 6 weeks ago, so they tell me at the office. I've looked them over carefully, and I think it is pretty clear what this man meant to do." "Did you go in?" asked Thorndyke. "Yes. Mr. Polton went with me and picked the lock, so I was able to go right through the rooms, and it is evident that this villain was not acting on the spur of the moment. He'd made a very neat plan, and I should say that it was pretty near to coming off. He had selected his chambers with remarkable judgment, and uncommonly well suited they were to his purpose. In the first place, they were the top set, nothing above them, no chance strangers passing up or down, and they were the only set on that landing. Then some previous tenant had made a little trap or grille in the outer door, a little hole about 6 inches square, with a sliding cover on the inside. That was the attraction, I fancy. The landing lamp was alight. He must have lighted it himself, as the landing was out of use, and I fancy he meant to watch through the grille for your friend to come and shoot him as he knocked at the door." "That would be taking more risk than he usually did," said Thorndyke. "You mean that the report of the shot would have been heard? Perhaps it might, but these modern, small-bore, repeating pistols make very little noise, though they are uncommonly deadly, especially if you open the nose of the bullets." "But," objected Thorndyke, "if he had been heard, there he would have been, boxed up in the chambers with no means of escape." Our acquaintance shook his head. "No," said he, "that's just what he wouldn't have been, and there is where he had planned the affair so neatly. These chambers are a double set. They have a second entrance that opens on the staircase of the next house. You see the idea. When he's fired his shot and made sure that it was all right, or all wrong, if you prefer it, he would just have slipped through to the other entrance, let himself out, shut the door quietly, and walked down the stairs. Then, if the shot had been heard, there was he, coming out of the next house to join the crowd and see what was the matter. It was a clever scheme, and, as I say, it might very well have come off if this poor young lady hadn't given it away. So that's all about the chambers. And now," here he cast a glance in my direction, "I must ask for a few particulars." He produced a large, black-covered notebook and, opening it on the table, looked at me inquiringly. "This," said Thorndyke, "is Mr. Superintendent Miller of the Criminal Investigation Department. He has charge of this case, so you must tell him exactly what happened. And try, Jardine, to be as clear and circumstantial as possible." The superintendent looked up sharply. "I had an impression," said he, "that this gentleman's name was Howard." "He has used the name of Howard since he has been staying here, for reasons which no longer exist, but which I will explain to you later. His name is Humphrey Jardine, and he is a Bachelor of Medicine." Mr. Miller entered these particulars in his book, and then said, "I suppose it is not necessary to ask if you were actually present when this poor lady was murdered?" No, I was not. And I presume you did not see the murderer? I saw a man, whom I believe to have been the murderer, come out of our entry and walk quickly towards the Tudor Street gate. But I can give you no description of him. I saw him from the window and by the light of the entry lamp. The superintendent wrote down my answer and reflected for a few moments. "Perhaps," said he, "you had better just give us an account of what happened, and we can ask you any questions afterwards. It's very painful for you, I know, but it has to be, as you will understand." It was more than painful. It was harrowing to reconstitute that hideous tragedy step by step, with the knowledge that the poor murdered corpse was still warm. But it had to be, and I did it, haltingly indeed, and with many a pause to command my voice. But in the end I gave the superintendent a full description of the actual occurrences, though I withheld any reference to those words that my poor dead friend had spoken for my ear alone. When I had read through and signed my statement, Mr. Miller studied his notebook with an air of dissatisfaction, and then turned to Thorndyke. "This is all quite clear, Doctor," said he, "and just about what you inferred from that letter. But it doesn't help us much. The question is, who is this man? I have an inkling that you know, Doctor." "I have a very strong suspicion as to who he is," replied Thorndyke. "That will do for me," said Miller. "Your strong suspicion is equal to another man's certainty. Do you know his name, sir?" "He has recently passed under the name of Samway," replied Thorndyke. "What his real name is, I think I shall be able to tell you later. Meanwhile, I can give you such particulars as are necessary for making an arrest." The superintendent looked narrowly at Thorndyke as the latter pressed the button of the electric bell. "Apparently, Doctor," said he, "you have been making some investigations concerning this man, and as it was not in connection with this crime, it must have been in connection with something else." "Yes," replied Thorndyke, "you are quite right, Miller, and it will be a matter of the deepest regret to me to my dying day that circumstances have hindered those investigations as they have. The delay has cost this poor woman her life. A few more days and my case would almost certainly have been complete, and then this terrible disaster would have been impossible." As Thorndyke finished speaking, the door opened quietly, and Polton entered with a small, neatly made parcel in his hand. "Ah," said Thorndyke, "you guessed what I wanted, and guessed right, as you always do, Polton. How many are there in that parcel?" "3 dozen, sir," replied Polton. "That ought to be enough for the moment. Hand them to the superintendent, Polton. If you want any more, Miller, we can let you have a further supply, and I am having a half-tone block made which will be ready to-morrow morning." "Are these portraits of the man you suspect?" asked Miller. "No, I haven't his portrait, unfortunately, but on each card is a photograph of 3 of his finger-prints, which are all I have been able to collect, and on the back is a description which will enable you easily to identify him. You can post them off to the various seaports and telegraph the description in advance, and I would recommend you specially to keep a watch on Dover and Folkestone, as I know that he has been in the habit of using that route." "Speaking of finger-prints," said Miller, "have you tried that letter for them?" "Yes," replied Thorndyke. "I powdered it very carefully, but there is not a single trace of a finger-print. He must have realized the risk he was taking, and worn gloves when he wrote it." The superintendent pocketed the parcel with a thoughtful air, and, after a few moments' cogitation, turned once more to Thorndyke. "You've supplied me with the means of arresting the man, Doctor," said he, "but that's all. Supposing I find him and detain him in custody, what then? I don't know that he murdered this poor woman. Do you? Dr. Jardine can't identify him, and apparently no one else saw him. I have no doubt that you have substantial grounds for suspecting him, but I should like to know what they are." Thorndyke reflected for a moment or two before replying. "You are quite right, Miller," he said at length. "You ought to have enough information to establish a prima facie case. But I think that on this occasion I can say no more than that, if you produce the man, you can rely upon me to furnish enough evidence to secure a conviction. Will that do?" "It will do from you, sir," replied Miller, rising and buttoning his overcoat. "I will get this description circulated at once. Oh, there was one more matter. The name of the deceased lady was Samway, the same as that of the suspected murderer. What was the relationship?" "She passed as, and presumably was, his wife." "Ah," said Miller, "I see. That was how she knew. Well, well, she was a brave woman to take the risk that she did, and she deserved something very different from what she got. But we are taught that there is a place where people who suffer injustice and misfortune in this world get it made up to them. I hope it's true, for her sake. And for his," he added abruptly, with a sudden change of tone. "Naturally you do," said Thorndyke. "But, meanwhile, our business is with this world. Spread your net close and wide, Miller. I shall never forgive you if you let this villain slip. It is our sacred duty to purge the world of his presence. You do your part, Miller, and be confident that I will do mine." "You can depend on me to do my best, sir," said Miller, "though I am working rather in the dark. I suppose you couldn't give me any sort of hint as to what you've got up your sleeve. You've no doubt, for instance, that it was really the man Samway who committed this murder?" Thorndyke, according to his usual habit, considered the superintendent's question for a while before answering. At length he replied: "I don't know why I shouldn't take you into my confidence to some extent, Miller, knowing you as I do. But you will remember that this is a confidence. The fact is that I am proposing to proceed against this man on an entirely different charge, but I am not quite ready to lay in information, and I want you to secure his person on the charge of murdering his wife while I complete the other case." "Is that another case of murder?" asked Miller. "Yes. The facts are briefly these. A certain Septimus Maddock, who was living with the Samways, died some time ago under what seemed to me very suspicious circumstances. He was nursed by Samway and his wife, and by no one else. The cause of death given on the certificate was, in my opinion, not the true one, and I am proceeding to verify my theory as to what was the real cause of death." "I see," said Miller. "You are applying for an exhumation of the body?" "Well, hardly an exhumation. The man Maddock was cremated." "Cremated!" exclaimed Miller. "Then we're done. There isn't any body to exhume." "No," agreed Thorndyke. "There is no body, but there are the ashes." "But surely," said Miller, "you can't get any information out of a few handfuls of bone ash." "That remains to be proved," replied Thorndyke. "I've applied for an authority to make an exhaustive examination of those ashes, and, if my opinion as to the cause of death is correct, I shall be able to demonstrate its correctness, and that will involve a charge of murder against this man Samway. It will also support a charge against him of attempt to murder Dr. Jardine, and furnish strong evidence connecting him with the horrible crime that has just been committed. So you see, Miller, that the important thing is to get possession of him before he has time to escape from this country, and hold him in custody, if necessary, while the evidence against him is being examined and completed. And I must impress on you that no time ought to be lost in getting the description circulated." "No, that's true," said Miller. "I'll go and telegraph it off at once, and I'll send one or two of our best men to watch the likely seaports." He shook hands with us all round, and, when we had all most fervently wished him success, he took his departure. As soon as he was gone, Jervis turned to his senior, and, looking at him with a sort of puzzled curiosity, exclaimed: "You're a most astounding person, Thorndyke. You really are. I thought I had begun to see daylight in that Maddock case, and now I find that I was all abroad. And I can't, for the life of me, conceive what in the world you expect to discover by examining a few pounds of calcined phosphates. Suppose Maddock was poisoned, what evidence will be obtainable from the ashes? of the poisons which could possibly have been used under the known circumstances, not one would leave a trace after cremation. But of course you've thought of all that." "Certainly I have," replied Thorndyke, "and I agree with you that the ashes of a body that has been cremated are highly unpromising material for a primary investigation. But does it not occur to you that, in a case where certain circumstantial evidence is available, excellent corroborative data might be obtained by the examination of the ashes?" "No," replied Jervis, "I can't say that it does." "It is not too late to consider the question," said Thorndyke. "I shall probably not get the authority for a day or two, so you will have time to turn the problem over in the interval. It is quite worth your while, I assure you, apart from this particular case, as a mere exercise in constructive theory. You can acquire experience from imaginary cases as well as from real ones, as I have often pointed out. In fact, much of my own experience has been gained in this way. I think I have mentioned to you that, in my early days, when I had more leisure than practice, it was my custom to construct imaginary crimes of an elaborately skilful type, and then, having of course all the facts, to consider the appropriate procedure for their detection. It was a most valuable exercise, for I was thus able to furnish myself with an abundance of problems of a kind that, in actual practice, are met with only at long intervals of years; and since then a quite considerable number of my imaginary cases have presented themselves in a more or less modified form for solution in the course of practice, and have come to me with the familiarity of problems that have already been considered and solved. That is what you should do, Jervis. Try the synthetic method, and then consider what analytical procedure would be appropriate to your result." "I have," Jervis replied gloomily. "I've worked at this confounded case until I feel like a rat that has been trying to gnaw through a plate-glass window. Still, I'll have another try. By the way, where are you going to make this examination?" "I think I shall do it here. I had thought of handing the ashes over to one of the more eminent analysts, but it will be only a small operation, well within the capacity of our own laboratory. I think of asking Professor Woodfield to come here and carry out the actual analysis. Polton will give him any help that he may want, and of course we shall be here to give any further assistance if he should need it." "Why not have made the analysis yourself?" asked Jervis. "Is there anything specially difficult or intricate about it?" "Not at all," replied Thorndyke. "But as the case will have to go into court on a capital charge, that is, assuming that my hypothesis turns out to be correct, I thought it best to have the analysis made by a man whose name as an authority on chemistry will carry special weight. Neither the judge nor the jury are likely to have much special knowledge of chemistry, but they will be able to appreciate the fact that Woodfield is a man with a world-wide reputation, and they will respect his opinion accordingly." "Yes," agreed Jervis, "I think you're quite right. A well-known name goes a long way with the jury. I hope your experiment will turn out as you expect, and I hope, too, that some of Miller's men will manage to lay that murderous devil by the heels. But I'm afraid they'll have their work cut out. He's a clever scoundrel, one must admit that. How do you suppose he contrived to track Jardine here?" "I think," replied Thorndyke, "that he must have seen us on one of the 2 occasions when we went to the mineral water works and followed us here. Then, when Jardine disappeared from his lodgings, he would naturally look for him here, this being, in fact, the only place known to him in connection with Jardine, excepting Batson's house, on which he also probably kept a watch." "But how would he have discovered that Jardine actually was here?" "There are a number of ways in which he might have ascertained the fact. A good many persons knew that we had a new resident. We could not conceal his presence here. Many of our visitors have seen him, and the porter and hangers-on of the inn will have noticed him taking his exercise in the morning. Samway himself even may have seen him, and he would easily have penetrated the disguise if he saw him out of doors, for there is no disguising a man's stature. He might have made inquiries of one of the porters or lamp-lighters, or he might have employed someone else to make inquiries. The fact that someone was staying here and that his name was Howard could not have been very difficult to discover, while, as for ourselves, we are as well known in the inn as the Griffin at Temple Bar. From the circumstance that he knew of our attendance at the Maidstone assizes, it seems likely that he had subsidized some solicitous clerk who would know our movements. "And I suppose," said I, "as he is gone now, I may as well go back to my lodgings." "Not at all," replied Thorndyke. "In the first place, we don't know that he's gone, and we do know that he is now absolutely desperate and reckless. And you must not forget, Jardine, that whether we charge him with murder in the case of Maddock, with the murder of poor Mrs. Samway, or the attempted murder of yourself, in either case you are the chief witness for the prosecution. You are the appointed instrument of retribution in this man's case, and you must take the utmost care of yourself until your mission is accomplished. He knows the value of your evidence better than you do, and it is still worth his while to get rid of you if he can. But you, I am sure, are at least as anxious as we are to see him hanged." "I'd sooner twist his neck with my own hands," said I. "I dare say you would," said Thorndyke, "and it is perfectly natural that you should. But it is not desirable. This is a case for a few fathoms of good stout hempen rope and the common hangman. The private vengeance of a decent man would be an undeserved honour for a wretch like this. So you must stay here quietly for a few days more and give us a little help when we need it." Thorndyke's decision was not altogether unwelcome. Shaken as I was by the shock of this horrible tragedy, I was in no state to return to the solitude of my lodgings. The quiet and tactful sympathy of my two friends, or I should rather say three, for Polton was as kind and gentle as a woman, was infinitely comforting, and their sober cheerfulness and the interest of their talk prevented me from brooding morbidly over the catastrophe of which I had been the involuntary cause. And, dreadful as the associations of the place were, I could not but feel that those of my older resorts would be equally painful. For me, at present, the Heath would be haunted by the figure of poor Letitia walking at my side, telling me her pitiful tale, and so pathetically craving my sympathy and friendship. And the Highgate Road could not but wring my heart with the recollection of that evening when we had walked together up the narrow lane, all unconscious of a black-hearted murderer stealing after us and foiled only by that futile spy, when, as we said good-bye, I had kissed her and she had run off blushing like a girl. Moreover, if Thorndyke's chambers were fraught with terrible and gloomy associations, they were also pervaded by an atmosphere of resolute, relentless preparation which was itself a relief to me. For, as the first shock of horrified grief passed, it left me possessed by a fury of hatred for the murderer, and consumed by an inextinguishable craving for vengeance. Nor by the time of suspense so long as we had anticipated, as the very next morning a letter arrived from the Home Office containing the necessary authority to make the proposed examination, and informing Thorndyke that on the following day the police would take possession of the ashes, which would be delivered to him by an officer who would remain to witness the examination and to resume possession of the remains when it was concluded. I saw very little more of Thorndyke that day, but gathered that he was busy making the final arrangements for the important work of the morrow, and clearing off various tasks so as to leave himself in from engagements. Nor did I enjoy much of Jervis's society, for he, too, was anxious to have the day free for the crucial experiment, which was, we hoped, to solve the mystery of Septimus Maddock's death, and explain the villain Samway's strange vindictiveness towards me. Left to myself, and by no means enamoured of my own society, I wandered up to the laboratory to see what Polton was doing and to distract my gloomy thoughts by a little gossip with him on the various technical processes of which he possessed so much curious information. I found him arrayed in a white apron, with the sleeves turned up, busily occupied with what I took to be a slab of dough, which he had spread on a pastry board and was levelling with a hardwood rolling pin. He greeted me as I entered with his queer, crinkly smile, but made no remark, and I stood a while in silence, watching him cut the paste in halves, sprinkle it with flour, fold it up, and once more roll it out into a sheet with a wooden pin. "Is this going to be a meat pie, Polton?" I asked at length. His smile broadened at my question, for which I suspect he had been waiting. "I don't think you'd care much for the flavour of it, if it was, sir," he answered. "But it does look like dough, doesn't it? It's moulding wax, a special formula of the doctor's own." "I thought that white powder was flour." "So it is, sir, the best wheaten flour. It's lighter than a mineral powder and more tenacious. You have to use some powder to reduce the stickiness of the wax, especially in a soft paste like this, which has a lot of lard in it." "What are you going to use it for?" I asked. "Ah!" exclaimed Polton, pausing to give the paste a vicious whack with the rolling pin. "There you are, sir. That's just what I've been asking myself all the time I've been rolling it out. The doctor, sir, God bless him, is the most exasperating gentleman in the world. He fairly drives me mad with curiosity at times. He will give me a piece of work to do, something to make perhaps, with full particulars, all the facts, you understand, perfectly clear and exact, with working drawings if necessary. But he never says what the thing is for. So I make a hypothesis for myself. Whole bundles of hypotheses I make, and they always turn out wrong. I assure you, sir," he concluded with solemn emphasis, "that I spent the best part of my life asking myself conundrums and giving myself the wrong answers." "I should have thought," said I, "that you would have got used to his ways by now." "You can't get used to him," rejoined Polton. "It's impossible. He doesn't think like any other man. Ordinary men's brains are turned out pretty much alike from a single mould, like a batch of pottery. But the doctor's brain was a special order. If there was any mould at all, that mould was broken up when the job was finished." "What you mean is," said I, "that he has a great deal more intelligence than is given to the rank and file of humanity." "No, I don't," retorted Polton. "It isn't a question of quantity at all. It's a different kind of intelligence. Ordinary men have to reason from visible facts. He doesn't. He reasons from facts which his imagination tells him exists, but which nobody else can see. He's like a portrait painter who can do you a likeness of your face by looking at the back of your head. I suppose it's what he calls constructive imagination, such as Darwin and Harvey and Pasteur and other great discoverers had, which enabled them to see beyond the facts that were known to the common herd of humanity." I was somewhat doubtful as to the soundness of Polton's views on the transcendental intellect, though respectfully admiring of the thoughtfulness of this curious little handicraftsman. Accordingly I returned to the more concrete subject of wax. "Haven't you any idea what this stuff is going to be used for?" "Not the slightest," he replied. "The doctor's instructions were to make 6 pounds of it, to make it soft enough to take a squeeze of a stiff feather if warmed gently, and firm enough to keep its shape in a half-inch layer with a plaster backing, and to be sure to have it ready by tomorrow morning. That's all. I know there's an important analysis on tomorrow, and I suppose this wax has got something to do with it. But as to what moulding wax can have to do with a chemical analysis, that's a question that I can't make head or tail of." Neither could I, though I had more data than Polton appeared to possess. Nor could Jervis, to whom I propounded the riddle when he came in to tea. We went up to the laboratory together and inspected not only the wax, but the exterior of 3 large parcels addressed to Professor Woodfield, care of Dr. Thorndyke, and bearing the labels of a firm of wholesale chemists. But neither of us could suggest any solution of the mystery, and the only result of our visit to the laboratory was that Polton was somewhat scandalized by the conduct of his junior employer, who consoled himself for his failure by executing with the wax a life-sized and highly grotesque portrait of Father Humperdinck. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of A Silent Witness by R. Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 21. The Final Problem. At exactly 11:30 in the following forenoon, Professor Woodfield arrived, bearing a massive cowhide bag which he deposited on a chair as a preliminary to taking off his hat and wiping his forehead. He was a big, burly, heavy-browed man, sparing of speech and rather gruff in manner. "Stuff arrived yet?" he asked when he had brought his forehead to a satisfactory polish. "I think it came yesterday morning," replied Thorndyke. "The deuce it did!" exclaimed Woodfield. "Yes. Draper's. 3 parcels from Townley and—" "Oh, you're talking of the chemicals. I meant the other stuff." "No. The officer hasn't arrived yet, but I expect he will be here in a few minutes. Superintendent Miller is a scrupulously punctual man." The Professor strode over to the window and glared out in the direction of Crown Office Row. "That man of yours got everything ready?" he asked. "Yes," answered Thorndyke, "and I've looked over the laboratory myself. Everything is ready. You can begin the instant the ashes are delivered to us." Woodfield expressed his satisfaction, or whatever he intended to express, by a grunt, without removing his eyes from the approach to our chambers. "Cab coming," he announced a few moments later. "Man inside with a parcel. That the officer?" Jervis looked out over the Professor's shoulder. "Yes," said he, "that's Miller. And confound it, here's Marchmont with old Humperdinck. Shall we bolt up to the laboratory and send down word that we're all out of town?" "I don't see why we should," said Thorndyke. "Woodfield won't be inconsolable if we have to leave him to work by himself for a while." The Professor confirmed this statement by another grunt, and, shortly afterwards, the clamour of the little brass knocker announced the arrival of the first contingent, which, when I opened the door, was seen to consist of the solicitor and his very reverend client. "My dear Thorndyke," exclaimed Marchmont, shaking our principal's hand, "what a shocking affair this is! This murder, I mean. I read about it in the paper. A dreadful affair." "Yes, indeed," Thorndyke assented. "A most callous and horrible crime." "Terrible, terrible!" said Marchmont. "So unpleasant for you too, and so inconvenient. Actually on your own stairs, I understand. But I hope they'll be able to catch the villain. Have you any idea who he is?" "I have a very strong suspicion," Thorndyke replied. "Ah!" exclaimed Marchmont. "I thought so. The rascal brought his pigs to the wrong market. What? Like doing a burglary at Scotland Yard. He couldn't have known who lived here. Hallo! Why, here's Mr. Miller. How d'ye do, Superintendent?" The officer, for whom I had left the door ajar, entered in his usual brisk fashion, and, having bestowed a comprehensive salutation on the assembled company, deposited on the table an apparently weighty parcel, securely wrapped and decorated with a label bearing the inscription, "This side up." "There, sir," said he, "there's your box of mystery, and I don't mind telling you that I'm on tenterhooks of curiosity to see what you're going to make of it." "Professor Woodfield is the presiding magician," said Thorndyke, "so we will hand it over to him. I suppose the casket is sealed?" "Yes, it was sealed in my presence, and I've got to be present when the seals are broken." "We'll break the seals up in the laboratory," said Woodfield, "but we may as well undo the parcel here." He produced a solid-looking pocket-knife, fitted with a practicable corkscrew, and having cut the string, stripped off the wrappings of the parcel. "God bless my soul!" exclaimed Marchmont, as the last wrapping was removed. "Why, it's a cremation urn! What in the name of fortune are you going to do?" Miller tapped the lid of the urn with a dramatic gesture. "Dr. Thorndyke," said he, "is going, I hope, to extract from the ashes in this casket an instrument of vengeance on the murderer of Mrs. Samway." "Ach!" exclaimed Father Humperdinck, "do not speak of vengeance in the presence of these poor remains of a fellow creature. Justice, if you like, but not vengeance. Vengeance is mine, says the Lord." "Yes," agreed Miller. "That's perfectly true, sir, and we quite understand your point of view. Still, we've got our job to do, you know." "But," said Marchmont, "I don't understand. What is the connection? These appear to be the remains of Septimus Maddock, whoever he may have been, and he seems to have died last November. What has he to do with the murder of this poor woman Samway?" "The connection is this," replied Thorndyke. "The man who murdered Mrs. Samway murdered the man whose ashes are in this urn. That is my proposition, and I hope, with the skilful aid of my friend Professor Woodfield, to prove it." "Well," said Marchmont, "it is a remarkable proposition, and the proof will be still more remarkable. I certainly thought that a body that had been cremated was beyond the reach of any possible inquiry." "I am afraid that is so, as a rule," Thorndyke admitted, "but I hope to find an exception in this case. Shall we go upstairs and commence the examination?" Woodfield having agreed with gruff emphasis, Miller picked up the casket, and we all proceeded to the laboratory, where Polton, like a presiding analytical demon, was discovered amidst his beloved apparatus. The casket was placed on a table, the seals broken, and the cover removed by Woodfield, whereupon we all, with one accord, craned forward to peer in at what looked like a mass of fragments of snowy madrepore coral. "Ach!" exclaimed Father Humperdinck, "but it is a solemn thought that these poor ashes was once a living man just like ourselves." "Yes," said Marchmont, "it is, and I suppose we shall all be pretty much alike by the time we reach this stage. Cremation is a leveller, with a vengeance. Still, I will say this much, these remains are perfectly unobjectionable in every way. In fact, they are almost agreeable in appearance, whereas an ordinary disinterment after this lapse of time would have been a most horrid business." "Yes, indeed," agreed Thorndyke. "I have had to make a good many examinations of exhumed bodies, and, as you say, they were very different from this. If I were not a practitioner of legal medicine, in which exhumation often furnishes crucial evidence, I should say that this cleanly and decent method of disposing of the dead was incomparably superior to any other. Unfortunately, it has serious medico-legal drawbacks. I think, Woodfield, that we will turn the ashes out on that sheet of paper on the bench, and then, with your permission, I will pick out the recognizable fragments and examine them while you are working on the small, powdery portions." He took up the urn, which was an oblong terracotta vessel some 14 inches in length, and very carefully inverted it over the large sheet of clean white paper. Then, from the dazzling, snowy heap, he picked out daintily the larger fragments, handling them with the utmost tenderness, for of course they were excessively fragile, and finally transferring them one by one to another sheet of paper at the other end of the bench. The appearance of the remains was not quite as I had expected. Among the powdery debris was a quite considerable number of larger fragments, most of which were easily recognizable by the anatomical eye, while some of the larger long bones almost gave the impression of having been broken to enable them to be placed in the urn, and suggested that a partial reconstitution, for the purpose of determining the stature or other peculiarities of the skeleton, was by no means as impossible as I had supposed. But, large and small alike, the pieces were strangely light and attenuated, like the ghosts of bones or artificial counterfeits in porous, spongy coral. When Thorndyke had picked out such of the fragments as he wished to examine, Professor Woodfield glanced casually over the collection, but suddenly he paused, and stooping over a large piece of the right innominate bone, narrowly inspected a somewhat shiny yellow stain on its inner surface. "Looks as if you were right, Thorndyke," he said in his laconic way. "Qualitatively, at any rate. We shall see what the quantitative test says." I pored over that dull yellow stain, as did Jervis also, but could make no guess at its nature or conceive any explanation of its presence. What interested me more was a small depression or cavity in the bone at the centre of the stain. That it was not the result of cremation was obvious from the fact that it was surrounded by a small area of sclerosed or hardened bone, which was quite plainly distinguishable on the spongy background, and which clearly pointed to some inflammatory change that had occurred during life. But of its cause, as of that of the stain itself, I could think of no intelligible explanation. "Have you enough of the small fragments to go on with for the present, Woodfield?" Thorndyke asked. "Plenty," replied Woodfield. "Then," said Thorndyke, "I will get on with my side of the inquiry. I shall want the whole plate camera first, Polton." While his assistant was preparing the camera, he laid several of the fragments on a baize covered board and secured them in position by threads attached to wooden-headed pins like diminutive braddles. When the fragments were fixed immovably, he placed the board in a vertical position on a stand in a good light, by which time Polton was ready to make the exposure. Meanwhile, Professor Woodfield was proceeding, under the horrified supervision of Father Humperdinck, with his part of the investigation. He was a matter-of-fact man, a chemist to the backbone, and to him it was evident that the late Septimus Maddock was simply so many pounds of animal phosphates. Quite composedly he shovelled up a scoopful of the ashes, which he emptied into the pan of a spring balance, and, having weighed out 1 1/4 pounds, shot the contents of the pan into a large mortar, and forthwith began to grind the fragments to a fine powder, humming a cheerful stave to the ring of the pestle. But his next proceeding scandalized the worthy Jesuit still more deeply. Having weighed out certain quantities of charcoal, sodium carbonate, and borax, he pulverized each in a second mortar, mixed the whole together, and shot the mixture into the first mortar, which contained the ash, stirring the entire contents up into a repulsive-looking grey powder. "But, my dear sir," exclaimed Father Humperdinck, "you are destroying the remains." Woodfield looked at him from under his beetling brows, but went on stirring. "Matter is indestructible," he replied stolidly, and with this he tipped the contents of the mortar on to a sheet of paper and transferred them to a large fire-clay crucible. "Now, Polton," said he, "is the furnace ready?" Polton disengaged himself for a moment from the camera and took up a position by the side of the big fire-clay drum with his hand on the gas-cock. Then Woodfield, having dropped 3 or 4 large iron nails into the crucible, carried the latter over to the furnace and lowered it into the central cavity. The cock was turned on by Polton and a match applied, whereupon a great purplish flame shot up with a roar from the mouth of the furnace, and even when this had been confined by the dropping on of the massive cover, the iron-cased cylinder continued to emit a muffled, sullen growl. While the crucible was heating, I transferred my attention to Thorndyke. The photographic operations were now concluded, and the moulding wax had just been produced from a warmed incubator. Polton's curiosity, and mine, was about to be satisfied. Thorndyke began by laying a thick slab of the warm and pliable wax on the middle of a smooth plate of varnished plaster, at each corner of which was a small hemispherical pit, and dusting powdered French chalk sparingly over the level surface of the wax. Then he took the large fragment of bone, which bore the mysterious yellow stain, and laid it on the wax with the stained side uppermost, pressing it very gently until it gradually sank into the soft pasty mass. Next he took a somewhat smaller slab of wax, and, having dusted its surface with French chalk, laid it on the fragment of bone, pressing it on gently but firmly, especially in the neighbourhood of the stain. Having squeezed some irregular-shaped lumps of wax on the back of the top slab, he fastened a strip of india-rubber round the edge of the plaster plate, so that it formed an upright rim, and turned to Polton. "Now mix a bowl of plaster, and mix it extra stiff, so that it will set quickly and hard." With a soft brush he painted a thin coat of oil on the exposed portion of the plaster plate, up to the edges of the wax, and including the little circular hollows. By the time he had done this, Polton reappeared from the workshop with a basin of liquid plaster, which he was beating up with a spoon as if preparing a custard or batter pudding. As soon as the plaster began to thicken, he poured it on the wax and the oiled slab until it formed a level mass, nearly flush with the top of the india-rubber rim. In a surprisingly short time the smooth, creamy liquid solidified into a substance having the appearance of icing sugar, and when Polton had stripped away the india-rubber rim, exposing the edge of the new plaster slab, this part of the process was finished. We will put this mould aside for the plaster to harden while we make the other mould," said Thorndyke. "Aren't you going to make moulds of all the fragments?" asked Jervis. "No," Thorndyke answered. "The photographs of the rest will be sufficient, and I don't think we shall want even those. In fact, what I am doing now is merely by way of extra precaution. We are obliged to destroy the fragments in order to make the analysis, so I am just putting their appearance on record. You never know what an ingenious defending counsel may spring on you." As Polton produced a second plate of varnished plaster, and Thorndyke began to prepare the wax for the next mould, I turned my attention once more to Professor Woodfield. He had now deserted the mortar, in which he had been preparing a further supply of the stuff, and taken up a position by the furnace, with a long pair of crucible tongs in his hand. On the bench, hard by, was an iron plate, and on this an oblong block of iron in which were 6 conical hollows. Presently Woodfield glanced at his watch, turned off the gas-cock, removed the cover of the furnace with his tongs, and, reaching down into the glowing interior, lifted out the nearly white-hot crucible. Instantly Marchmont, Humperdinck and Jervis gathered round to watch, and even Thorndyke left his mould to come and see the result of the first trial. Having stood the crucible on the iron plate while he picked out the large nails one by one, Woodfield lifted it and steadily poured its molten contents into the first hollow in the iron block, which they soon filled, and overflowing ran along the iron plate in glowing streams that soon grew dull from contact with the cold surface. I noticed that, as the crucible was slowly tilted, Thorndyke kept his eyes fixed on its interior, as also did Jervis and Woodfield, and watching closely, I saw, just as the vessel was nearly empty, what looked somewhat like a red-hot oil globule floating in the last of the glowing liquid. This passed out as the crucible was tilted further, and disappeared into the iron mould, when Woodfield, having exchanged a quick, significant glance with Thorndyke, proceeded forthwith, in his matter-of-fact way, to fill up the still red-hot vessel with another pound and a quarter of the late Septimus Maddock. "I suppose," said Marchmont, "it is premature to ask you what is the final object of these very interesting operations?" "It's no use asking me," replied Woodfield, "because I don't know. I am searching for traces of a particular substance, but what may be the significance of its presence, I haven't the slightest idea. You'd better ask Dr. Thorndyke, and he won't tell you." "No, I know," said Marchmont. "Thorndyke will never tell you anything until he can tell you everything. By the way, will the remains be completely destroyed, or will it be possible to recover them?" "They are not destroyed at all," replied Woodfield. "They are all in the slag that came out of the crucible. We shall simply put the slag in the urn. There's a little charcoal, soda and borax added, but nothing is taken away." I could see that to the unchemical mind of Father Humperdinck this was far from satisfactory, and I observed him poring, with obvious disapproval, over the dark-coloured, glassy masses of slag on the iron plate. Ashes to ashes was an intelligible formula, but ashes to slag was quite another matter, for which no provision had been made in any known ritual. After a rather hurried luncheon the wax moulds were carefully opened and the fragments of bone picked out, when it was seen that each fragment had left a perfect impression on the wax surface into which it had been pressed. These hollow impressions were now filled with liquid plaster, and, when the latter had thickened sufficiently, the two halves of each mould were quickly fitted together and kept in close contact by a weight. During the interval which was necessary to allow of the plaster setting quite firmly, I had leisure to note that Professor Woodfield had filled 2 more of the cavities in the iron mould. Now that the furnace was thoroughly hot, he was able to work rather more quickly, and he had economized time by leaving a crucible to heat while we were at lunch. He was preparing to take the 4th charge from the furnace when I observed Polton removing the weight from one of the moulds and hurriedly transferred my patronage to his part of the entertainment. The mould on which he was operating was the one bearing the impressions of the stained fragment of the innominate bone, and when he separated the 2 halves and exposed the newly made cast inside, one might have thought that the actual bone had been left in, So perfectly did the snowy plaster cast reproduce the dazzlingly white calcined bone. But naturally the stain did not appear in the cast, a defect which Thorndyke proceeded at once to remedy by making a tracing of the exact position and extent of the coloured patch and transferring it to the cast. Then, and not till then, Thorndyke regretfully handed the original fragment to Professor Woodfield, who impassively dropped it into the mortar and pounded it into a mere characterless powder. After the opening of the second mould and the removal of the casts, the interest of the investigation lapsed for a time. Woodfield's operations were doubtless the most important part of the procedure, but they were not thrilling to look on at. In fact, they became by unvarying repetition decidedly tedious, and when the last charge, containing the uttermost crumb of ash, had been placed in the furnace, and there was nothing to do but stare at the great fireclay drum, Marchmont and Humperdinck began to yawn in the most portentous manner. I rather wondered that they did not go, for the investigation was no business of theirs, and there was little entertainment in gazing at the outside of the furnace or watching Polton and the superintendent gather up the masses of slag from the plate and drop them into the casket. But I suppose that they, like myself, were consoling themselves for the tedium of the chemist's manipulations by the prospect of satisfying their curiosity as to the final result of the experiment. When at length the last charge was ready, Woodfield withdrew the white-hot crucible from the furnace and stood it on the iron plate. But this time he did not pour out the contents. Instead, he tilted the iron mould, and, picking out the conical masses of slag that it contained, one by one, lowered them with his tongs into the hot crucible. Then, having thrown in a little fresh flux, he returned the crucible to the furnace. "Why didn't he pour out the melted stuff this time?" Marchmont asked. "Because," Thorndyke replied, "I want, for certain reasons, to have the total result of the analysis in a single mass. Each of those little cones of slag contains the result from a sixth part of the ash. The crucible now contains the matter extracted from the whole of the ashes. For my purposes this is more suitable, as you will see in a few minutes, for we shall not have to leave the crucible in the furnace so long this time." "I am glad of that," said Marchmont, "though this has been a most interesting, and I may say fascinating experience. I am delighted to have had an opportunity of witnessing these most instructive and The rest of the sentence was rendered somewhat obscure by a colossal yawn, but very soon the interest of the proceedings was revived by Woodfield, who approached the furnace with a determined air and removed its cover with somewhat of a flourish. "Now we shall see, Thorndyke," said he, turning off the gas and reaching down into the glowing cavity with his tongs. He lifted out the crucible and, standing it on the iron plate, took out the nails, tapping each on the side of the pot as he withdrew it. "Do you want me to pour it out, or shall I break the pot?" asked Woodfield. "That rests with you," replied Thorndyke. "Better break the pot, then," said Woodfield. This entailed a further spell of expectant waiting, and we all stood round, gazing impatiently at the crucible as it slowly faded from bright red to dull red, and from this to its natural dull drab. It was quite a long time before Woodfield considered it cool enough to be broken. Indeed, I half suspected him of prolonging our suspense with deliberate menace. At length he took up a peculiarly shaped hammer which Polton had handed to him, and, laying the crucible on its side, struck it sharply near the bottom with the pointed beak. Then he turned the pot over and struck a similar blow on the opposite side, upon which the bottom of the crucible broke off cleanly, exposing the mass of dark, glassy slag, and, embedded in it, a bright button of metal. "What metal is that?" Jervis demanded eagerly. The Professor struck the button smartly with the hammer, whereupon it detached itself from the slag and rolled on to the plate. "Lead," said he. "I don't vouch for its purity, but it's undoubtedly lead." Jervis turned to Thorndyke with a puzzled look. "You can't be suggesting," said he, "that this was a case of acute lead poisoning. The circumstances didn't admit of it. And besides, the The quantity of lead is impossibly large." "I should suppose," interposed Miller, "that the doctor was suggesting a most particularly acute form of lead poisoning, only that it is impossible to imagine that a cremation certificate would be granted in a case where a man had been killed by a pistol shot." "I am not so sure of that," said Thorndyke, "though it is not likely that a cremation certificate would be applied for under those circumstances. But I am certainly not suggesting lead poisoning." "What do you say is the weight of this button, Thorndyke?" the Professor asked. "That," replied Thorndyke, "depends on its relation to the total content of lead in the ashes. What percentage do you suppose has been lost in the process of reduction?" "Not more than 10%, I hope. You may take this button as representing 90% of the total lead, perhaps a little more." Thorndyke made a rapid calculation on a scrap of paper. "I suggest," said he, "that the total lead in the ashes was 386 grains. Deducting a tenth, say 38½ grains, we have 347½ grains, which should be the weight of this button." Woodfield picked up the button and, striding over to the glass case which contained the chemical balance, slid up the front and, placing the button in one pan, put the weight corresponding to Thorndyke's estimate in the other. On turning the handle that released the balance, it was seen that the button was appreciably heavier than Thorndyke had stated, and Woodfield adjusted the weights with a small pair of forceps until the index stood in the middle of the graduated arc. "The weight is 349½ grains," said Woodfield. "That means that my assay was rather better than I thought. You were quite right, Thorndyke, as you generally are. I wonder what the object was that weighed 386 grains. Are you going to tell us?" Thorndyke felt in his waistcoat pocket. "It was an object," said he, "very similar to this." As he spoke, he produced a rather large, dark-coloured bullet, which he handed to Woodfield, who immediately placed it in the pan of the balance and tested its weight. "Just a fraction short of 387 grains," said he. The superintendent peered curiously into the balance case, and, taking the bullet out of the pan, turned it over in his fingers. "That's not a modern bullet," said he. "They don't make 'em that size now, and they don't generally make 'em of pure lead." "No," Thorndyke agreed, "they don't. This is an old French bullet. A chassepot of about 1870. "A chassepot!" exclaimed Humperdinck, with suddenly awakened interest. "Yes," said Thorndyke, "and this button," he picked it up from the floor of the balance case as he spoke, "was once a chassepot bullet too. This, Father Humperdinck," he added, holding out the little mass of metal towards the Jesuit, "was the bullet which struck your friend Vitalis Reinhardt near Saarbrück more than 30 years ago." The priest was thunderstruck. For some seconds he gazed from Thorndyke's face to the button of lead, with his mouth agape and an expression of utter stupefaction. "But," he exclaimed at length, "it is impossible! How can it be in the ashes of a stranger?" "I take it," said Marchmont, "that Dr. Thorndyke is suggesting that this was the body of Vitalis Reinhardt." "Undoubtedly I am," said Thorndyke. "It sounds a rather bold supposition," Marchmont observed, a little dubiously. "Isn't it basing a somewhat startling conclusion upon rather slender data? The presence of the lead is a striking fact, but still, taken alone—" "But it isn't taken alone," Thorndyke interrupted. "It is the final link in a long chain of evidence. You will hear that evidence later, but, as it happens, I can prove the identity of these remains from facts elicited by the examination that we have just made. Let me put the argument briefly. First, I will draw your attention to these plaster casts which you have seen me make from the original bones. Take, to begin with, these small fragments. Dr. Jervis will tell you what bones they are." He handed the small casts to Jervis, who looked them over, not for the first time, and passed them to me. "I say that they represent 2 complete fingers in the first or proximal joint of a right thumb. What do you say, Jardine?" "That is what I had already made them out to be," I replied. "Very well," said Thorndyke. "That gives us an important initial fact. These remains contain 2 complete fingers and the first joint of a thumb. But these remains profess to be those of a man named Septimus Maddock. Now this man is known to have had deformed hands of the kind described as brachydactylous. In such hands all the fingers are incomplete. They have only 2 joints instead of the normal 3, and the first or proximal joint of the thumb is absent. Obviously, then, these remains cannot be those of Septimus Maddock, as alleged. But if not Maddock's remains, whose are they? From certain facts known to me, I had assumed them to be those of Vitalis Reinhardt. Let us see what support that assumption has received. Reinhardt is known to have been wounded in the right hip by a chassepot bullet, and the bullet was never extracted. Now I find among these remains a considerable portion of the right hip bone. In that bone is a mark which plainly shows that it has been perforated, and the perforation repaired, and there is a cavity in which a foreign body of about the size of a chassepot bullet has been partly embedded. The chemical composition of that foreign body is plainly indicated by a stain which surrounds the cavity, which stain is evidently due to oxide of lead. Clearly the foreign body was composed of lead, which will have melted in the cremation furnace and run away, but left a small portion in the cavity, which small portion, becoming oxidized, the oxide will have liquefied and become soaked up by the absorbent bone ash, thus producing the stain. Finally, we find by assay that this foreign body actually was composed of lead, and that its weight was, within a negligible amount of error, 386 grains, which is the weight of a chassepot bullet. I say that the evidence, from the ashes alone, is conclusive. But this is only corroborative of conclusions that I had already formed on a quite considerable body of evidence. Are you satisfied, Marchmont? I mean, of course, only in respect of a prima facie case." "Perfectly satisfied," replied Marchmont. "And now I understand why you insisted on my being present at this investigation and bringing Father Humperdinck, which, I must admit, has been puzzling me the whole day. By the way, I rather infer from what you said that there has been foul play. Is that so?" "I think," replied Thorndyke, "there can hardly be a doubt that Reinhardt was murdered by Septimus Maddock." Father Humperdinck's face suddenly turned purple. "And this man Maddock," he exclaimed fiercely, "this murderer of my poor friend Vitalis, where is he?" "He is being sought by the police at this moment," replied Thorndyke. "He must be caught!" Father Humperdinck shouted in a furious voice. "And when he is caught, he must be punished as he deserves. I shall not one moment rest until he is hanged as high as Haman." Here I caught a quick glance from Marchmont's eyes, and seemed to hear a faint murmur which framed the words, "Vengeance is mine." "But," the Jesuit continued, after a momentary pause, in the same loud, angry tone, "this villain has a double crime committed. He has murdered a good, a generous, a pious man, and he has robbed the poor, the suffering, and the unfortunate." "How has he done that?" asked Marchmont. "By murdering the benefactor of our society," was the answer. "Yes, to be sure," agreed the solicitor. "I hadn't thought of that. Of course, the original will in favour of Miss Vyne probably stands without modification." At this point Superintendent Miller interposed. "You were saying, sir, that the man Maddock is now being sought by the police. Do you mean under that name?" "No," answered Thorndyke. "I mean under the name of Samway. Septimus Maddock alias Isaac Van Dam, is written off as deceased, but Samway, alias Maddock, alias Burton of Bruges, alias Gill, is his reincarnation, and as such I commend him to your attention, and I hope, Miller, you will be able to produce him shortly in the flesh. The evidence, as you see, is now ready, and all that is lacking is the prisoner. He shan't be lacking long, sir, if any efforts of mine can bring him to light. I see a case here that will pay for all the work that we can put into it. And now, with your permission, doctor, I will take possession of this urn and get off, to see that everything necessary is being done. The superintendent, as so often happens with departing guests, infected our other two visitors with a sudden desire to be gone. Father Humperdinck, especially, seemed unwilling to lose sight of the police officer, who was correspondingly anxious to escape, and, having wished us a very hasty adieu, hurried down the stairs in his wake, followed at a greater interval by his legal adviser. Chapter 21. Chapter 22 of A Silent Witness by R. Austin Freeman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anna Simon. Chapter 22. Thorndyke reviews the case. When Professor Woodfield, having deliberately packed his bag and, to my great relief and Jervis's, declined Thorndyke's invitation to stay and take tea with us, presently took his departure, we descended to the sitting-room, whither Polton followed us almost immediately with a tea-tray, having, apparently, boiled the kettle in the adjacent workshop while the final act of the analysis was in progress. He placed the tray on a small table by Thorndyke's chair, and, evidently anticipating the inevitable discussion on the results of the analysis, made up the fire on a liberal scale and retired with unconcealed reluctance. As soon as we were alone, Jervis opened the subject by voicing his and my joint desire for more light. "This has been a great surprise to me, Thorndyke," said he. "A complete surprise?" Thorndyke asked. "No, I can't say that. The solution of the problem was one that I'd proposed to myself, but I'd rejected it as impossible, and it looks impossible still, though I now know it to be the true solution." "I quite appreciate your difficulty," said Thorndyke, "and I see that if you did not happen to light on the answer to it, the difficulty was insuperable. That was the really brilliant feature in Maddock's plan. But for a single fact which was almost certain to be overlooked, the real explanation of the circumstances would appear utterly incredible. Even if suspicion had been aroused later and the true explanation suggested, there seemed to be one fact with which it was absolutely irreconcilable." "Yes," agreed Jervis, "that is what I have felt." "The truth is," said Thorndyke, "that this crime was planned with the most diabolical cleverness and subtlety. We realize that when we consider by what an infinitely narrow margin it failed. Indeed, we can hardly say that it did fail. As far as we can see, it succeeded completely, and if the criminal could only have accepted its success, there seems to be no reason why any discovery should ever have taken place. Looking back on the case, we see that our experience has been the same as O'Donnell's. We had no clue whatever excepting the one that was furnished by the criminal himself in his unnecessary efforts to obtain even greater security. Suppose Maddock, having carried out his plan successfully, had been content to leave it at that, who would have known, or even suspected, that a crime had been committed? Not a soul, I believe. But instead of that, he must needs do what the criminal almost invariably does. He must tinker at the crime when all is going well, and surround himself by a number of needless safeguards by which, in the end, attention is attracted to his doings. He knows, or believes he knows, that Jardine has in his possession certain knowledge of a highly dangerous character. He does not ask himself whether Jardine is aware that he possesses such knowledge, but, appraising that knowledge at what he himself knows to be its value, he decides to get rid of Jardine as the one element of danger. And that was where he failed. If he had left Jardine alone, the whole affair would have passed off as perfectly normal, and its details would soon have been lost sight of and forgotten. Even as it was, he missed complete success only by a hair's breadth. But for the most trivial coincidence, Jardine's body might be lying undiscovered in that cellar at this very moment. "That's a comfortable thought for you, Jardine," my younger colleague remarked. "Very," I agreed, with a slight shudder at the recollecting of that horrible death trap. "But what was the coincidence? I never understood how you came to be in that most unlikely place at that very opportune moment." "It was the merest chance," replied Thorndyke. "I happened to have called in at the hospital that evening, and, having an hour to spare, it occurred to me to look in at Batson's and see if you were getting on quite happily in your new command. As I had induced you to take charge, I felt some sort of responsibility in the matter." "It was exceedingly kind of you, sir," said I. "Not in the least," said Thorndyke. "It was just the ordinary solicitude of the teacher for a promising pupil. Well, when I arrived at the house, I found that excellent girl, Maggie, standing on the doorstep, looking anxiously up and down the street. It seemed that, on reflection, she was still convinced that the works were untenanted, and the oddity of the whole set of circumstances had made her somewhat uneasy. I waited a few minutes and disposed of one or two patients, and then, as you did not return, after what seemed an unaccountably long absence, I very easily induced her to show me where the place was; and when we arrived there, the deserted aspect of the building and the notice board over the gate seemed rather to justify her anxiety. I rang the bell loudly, as I dare say you know, but I did not wait very long. When I failed to get any response, I, too, became suspicious, and proceeded without delay to pick the lock of the wicket; and it is most fortunate that the wicket was unprovided with a bolt, which would have delayed me very considerably. You know the rest. When I shouted your name you must have tried to answer, for I caught a kind of muffled groan and the sound of tapping, which guided me and Maggie to your prison. But it was a near thing, for when I opened the cellar door you fell out quite unconscious and accompanied by a gush of carbon dioxide that was absolutely stifling." "Yes," said I, "it was touch and go. A few minutes more and it would have been all up with me. I realized that as soon as I recovered consciousness. But I couldn't, for the life of me, understand why anybody should want to murder me, and I'm not so very clear on the subject now. I really knew nothing about Maddock." "You knew more than anyone else knew, and he thought you knew more than you did. But perhaps it would be instructive to review the case in detail." "It would be very instructive to me," said Jervis, "for I don't, even now, see how you managed to bridge over those gaps that stopped me in my attempts to make a hypothesis that covered all the circumstances." "Very well," said Thorndyke. "Then we will begin at the beginning. And the beginning for me was the finding of Jardine as I have described it. Here was a pretty plain case of attempted murder, evidently premeditated and apparently committed by some person who had access to these works; evidently also conceived and planned with considerable knowledge, skill and foresight, though with how much foresight I did not realize until I had heard Jardine's story. When I had Jardine's account of the affair, I saw that the crime had been planned with quite remarkable ingenuity and judgment. In fact, the circumstances had been so carefully considered, and contingencies so well provided for that, but for a single tactical error, the plan would have succeeded. That error was in making the pretended emergency a surgical injury. If the letter to Jardine had stated that the man was in a fit, instead of suffering from a wound, our friend would have had no need to call at the surgery for appliances, but would have gone straight to the works. And there, in all probability, his body would still be lying, for no one would have known whither he had gone, and even if his body had been accidentally discovered, all traces of the means by which he had been killed would probably have been removed. There would have been nothing to show that he had not strayed into the deserted factory and turned on the gas himself. Indeed, it is pretty certain that matters would have been so arranged as to convey that impression to the persons who made the discovery. "There was the letter," said I. "That would have given things away to some extent." "But you would have had it in your pocket, from which he would, of course, have removed it. We may be sure that he had not overlooked the letter. It was the need for surgical appliances that he had overlooked. But, in spite of this error, the plan was ingenious, subtle, and clearly not the work of an ignorant man. And here I would point out to you that this latter fact was one of great importance in searching for the solution of the mystery. We knew something of our man. He was subtle, resourceful, and absolutely ruthless. Noting this, I was prepared, in pursuing the case, to find his other actions characterized by subtlety, resourcefulness, and ruthlessness. His further actions were not going to be those of a dullard or an ignoramus. But this was not all the information that I had concerning the personality of this unknown villain. Jervis and I looked over the cellars that same night within an hour and a half of the rescue and before anything had been moved. We were then in a position to infer that the unknown was probably a somewhat tall man and above the average of strength, as shown by the weight, position, and arrangement of the iron bottles. Moreover, since there was no faintest trace of a finger print on any of them, it followed that some precaution against them, such as gloves, had been adopted, which again suggested either a professional criminal or a person well acquainted with criminal methods. So much for the man. As to the rest of the information that I obtained by looking into the cellar, it seemed at the time meagre enough, and yet, when considered by the light of Jardine's statement, it turned out to be of vital importance. You remember what it was, Jardine? That cellar contained certain objects. They seemed very unilluminating and commonplace, but, according to my invariable custom, I considered them attentively and made a written list of them. Do you remember what they were? Yes, quite well. There were 10 empty cylinders, a spanner, a packing case. What were the dimensions of the case? Thorndyke interrupted. 7 foot long by 2½ wide and deep. Then there were a couple of waterproof sheets and a quantity of straw. That is the lot, I think, and I'll be hanged if I can see what any of them, excepting the 3 cylinders that were used for my benefit, have to do with the case. Can you, Jervis? I'm afraid I can't, he replied. They are all such very ordinary objects. Ordinary or not, said Thorndyke, there they were, and I made a note of them on the principle, which I am continually impressing on my students, that you can never judge in advance what the evidential value of any fact will be, and on the further principle that, in estimating evidence, there is no such thing as a commonplace fact or object. Until I had heard Jardine's account of the affair, there was not much to be gained by thinking about the possibilities that it presented. There was, however, one point to be settled, and I dealt with it at once. My slight inspection of the works had shown that no business was being carried on in them, and the question was whether they were completely untenanted or whether there was some person who had regular access to them. My enquiries resulted, as you know, in the unearthing of the mysterious Mr. Gill. but what his relation to the affair might be I was not at the moment in a position to judge. Then came our talk with Jardine, from which emerged the fact that the ordinary motives of murder apparently did not exist in this case, and that the crime appeared to have its origin in circumstances that had arisen locally and recently; and, on our proceeding to search for such conditions as might conceivably generate an adequate motive, we lighted on a case of cremation. Now, it is my habit, whenever I have to deal with death which has been followed by cremation, to approach the case with the utmost caution and scrutinize the circumstances most narrowly; for, admirable as is this method of disposing of the dead regarded from a hygienic standpoint, it has the fatal defect of lending itself most perfectly to the more subtle forms of murder, and especially to the administration of poison. By cremation all traces of the alkaloids, the toxines, and the other organic poisons are utterly destroyed, while of the metals, the three whose compounds are most commonly employed for criminal purposes, arsenic, antimony, and mercury, are volatilized by heat and would be more or less completely dissipated during the incineration of the body. It is true that the most elaborate precautions in the form of examination and certification are prescribed, and usually taken, I presume, before cremation is performed; but, as every medical jurist knows, precautions taken before the event are useless, for, to be effective, they would have to cover every possible cause of death, which would be impracticable. Hence, as suspicion, in case of poisoning, commonly does not arise until some time after death, I always give the closest consideration to the antecedent circumstances in cases where cremation has been performed. But in this case of Jardine's it was at once obvious that the circumstances called for the minutest inquiry, and that no inquiry had been made. On the face of it the case was a suspicious one, and the curious incident that Jardine described made it look more suspicious still, and moreover suggested a possible motive for the attempt on his life. Apparently he had seen, or was believed to have seen, something that he was not desired to see, something that it was not intended that any one should see. Now, what might that something have been? Apparently it was connected with the hand, or with the part of the arm adjacent to the hand. I considered the possibilities, and at once they fell into two categories. That something might have been a wound, an injury, a hypodermic needle mark, something, that is to say, related to the cause of death; or it might have been a mutilation, a deformity, a finger ring, a tattoo mark, something, that is to say, related to the identity of the deceased; and it followed that the cremation might have been made use of to conceal either the cause of death or the identity of the body. But all this was purely speculative. The case looked suspicious, but there was not a particle of positive evidence that anything abnormal had occurred. At this point Jardine exploded on us his second mystery, that of the dead cleric at Hampstead. This gave us at once an adequate motive for getting rid of him, for it had every appearance of a case of murder with successful concealment of the body, and Jardine was the only witness who could testify to its having occurred. On hearing of this I was for a moment disposed to dismiss the cremation case, to consider that the suspicious elements in it had been magnified by our imaginations in our endeavours to find an explanation of the assault on Jardine. Moreover, since we now had a sufficient motive for that assault, the cremation case appeared to be outside the scope of the inquiry. But there was a difficulty. It was now 6 weeks since Jardine had encountered the body in the lane, and during that time he had been entirely unmolested. The assault had occurred on his moving into a new neighbourhood, to which he had come unexpectedly, unannounced. Moreover, the assault had been committed by some person who either had access to the factory or was, at least, well acquainted with it, and who, therefore, seemed to be connected with the new neighbourhood. And it was committed within a few days of the cremation incident. Furthermore, the assault was manifestly premeditated and prepared, but yet the circumstances, namely Jardine's recent and unexpected appearance in the neighbourhood, were such as to make it certain that the crime could have been planned only a day or two before its execution, which again seemed to connect it with the cremation case rather than with the Hampstead case. There were two more points. We've seen that Jardine's would-be murderer was a subtle, ingenious, resourceful and cautious villain, but a crime adjusted to the conditions of cremation is exactly such a crime as we should expect of such a man, whereas the Hampstead crime, assuming it to be a crime, appeared to have been a somewhat clumsy affair, though the successful concealment of the body pointed to a person of some capacity, so that the former crime was more congruous with the known personality of the would-be murderer than the latter. The second point was made on further investigation. The day after our consultation I looked round the neighbourhood with the aid of a large-scale map, when I discovered that the yard of the factory in Norton Street backed on the garden of the Samways' house in Gayton Street. This again suggested a connection between the cremation case and the assault on Jardine, and the suggestion was so strong that once more the cremation incident assumed the uppermost place in my mind. I considered that case at length. Assuming a crime to have been committed, what was the probable nature of that crime? Now, cremation, as I have said, tends to destroy two kinds of evidence, namely, that relating to the cause of death and that relating to the identity of the body, whence it follows that the two crimes which it may be used to conceal are murder and substitution. To which of these crimes did the evidence point in the present instance? Well, we had the undoubted fact that cremation had been performed pursuant to the expressed wishes of Septimus Maddock, the man who was alleged to have been cremated. But if it was a case of murder, the crime must have been hurriedly planned a few days before the man's death, that is, after the execution of the will, for we could assume that Maddock would not have connived at his own murder, whereas if it was a case of substitution, Maddock himself was probably the actual agent. Considering the circumstances, the inexplicable, symptomless illness and the unexpected death, the latter crime was obviously more probable than the former. The illness in that case would be a sham illness deliberately planned to prepare the way for the introduction of the substituted body. Moreover, the attendant circumstances were more in favour of substitution than of murder. Of the 3 doctors who saw the body, only one had seen a living man, and that one, Batson, was more than half blind and wholly inattentive and neglectful. For the purpose of substitution, no more perfectly suitable practitioner could have been selected. The identity of the body was taken for granted. Naturally enough, I admit, and no verification was even thought of. Then, as to Jardine's experience, the hand or wrist is not at all a likely region on which to find either a fatal injury or the trace of a hypodermic injection, whereas it is a most important region for purposes of identification. The hand is highly characteristic in itself, even when normal, and there is no part of the body that is so subject to mutilation, or in which mutilations and deformities are so striking, so conspicuous, and so characteristic. Lost fingers, stiff fingers, webbed fingers, supernumerary fingers, contracted palm, deformed nails, brachydactyly, and numerous other abnormal conditions are not only easily recognized, but, since the hand is usually unclothed and visible, their existence will be known to a large number of persons. The evidence, in short, was strongly in favour of substitution as against murder. If, however, the body which was cremated was not that of Maddock, then it was the body of some other person. That is to say, that the theory of substitution left us with a dead body that was unaccounted for. And since a dead body implies the death for some person, the theory of substitution left us with a death unaccounted for and obviously concealed. That is to say, it raised a strong presumption of the murder of some unknown person. And here it seemed that our data came to an end, that we had no material whatever for forming any hypothesis as to the identity of the person whose dead body we were assuming to have been substituted for that of Septimus Maddock. But while I was thus turning over the possibilities of this cremation case, the other, the Hampstead case, continued to lurk in the background of my mind. It was much less hypothetical. There was positive evidence of some weight that a crime had been committed, and the circumstances offered a fully adequate motive for getting rid of Jardine. Thus it was natural that I should raise the question. Was it possible that the two cases could be in any way connected? At the first glance the suggestion looked absolutely wild, but still I considered it at length. And then it looked somewhat less wild. The two cases had this in common, that if a crime had been committed, Jardine was the sole witness. Moreover, the supposition that the two cases were connected and incriminated the same parties greatly intensified the motive for making away with Jardine. But there was another and much stronger point in favour of this view. If we adopted the theory of substitution, it was impossible, on looking at the two cases, to avoid being struck by the very curious converseness of their conditions. In the Hampstead case we were dealing with a body which had suddenly vanished, no one could say whither. In the Maddock case we were dealing with a body which had suddenly appeared, no one could say whence. When I reflected on this very striking appearance of relation, it was inevitable that I should ask myself the question, is it conceivable that these two bodies could have been one and the same? That the body which was cremated could have been the body which Jardine saw in the lane? Again, at the first glance, the question looked absurd. The first body was seen by Jardine more than 6 weeks before the alleged death of Maddock, and the body which he saw at the Samways' house was that of a man newly dead, with rigor mortis just beginning. It was, indeed, barely conceivable that the Hampstead body was not actually dead, and that the man might have lingered on alive for 6 weeks. But this suggestion failed to fit the known facts in two respects. In the first place, the body which Jardine saw in the lane was, from his description, pretty unmistakably a dead body, and in the second, the sham illness of Maddock and the elaborate leisurely preparations suggest a complete control of the time factor, which would be absent if those preparations were adjusted to a dying man who might expire at any moment. Rejecting this suggestion, then, the further question arose. Is it possible that the body that was seen in the lane could, after an interval of 6 weeks, have been produced in Gayton Street, perfectly fresh and in a state of incipient rigor mortis? And when the question was thus fairly stated, the answer was obviously in the affirmative. For is it not a matter of common knowledge that the bodies of sheep are habitually brought from New Zealand to London, traversing the whole width of the tropics in the voyage, and are delivered, after an interval of more than 6 weeks, perfectly fresh and in a state of incipient rigor mortis? The physical possibility was beyond question. But if physically possible, was such preservation practicable? Well, how are the bodies of the sheep preserved? By exposing them continuously to intense cold. And how is that intense cold produced? Roughly speaking, by the volatilization of a liquefied gas, ammonia in the case of the sheep. But behold, the very man whom we are suspecting of being the agent in this crime is a man who has command of large quantities of a liquefied gas, and who has hired a mineral water factory for no apparent reason, and put the premises to no apparent use." At this point Jervis brought his fist down with a bang on the arm of his chair. "Idiot!" he exclaimed. "Ass, fool, dolt, imbecile that I am! With those cylinders staring me in the face, too! Of course, it was that interval of 6 weeks that brought me up short. And yet I'd actually heard Jardine describe the cloud of carbon dioxide snow that fell on his face. Don't you consider me an absolute donkey, Thorndyke?" "Certainly not," replied Thorndyke. "You happened to miss a link, and, of course, the chain would not hold. It occurs to us all now and again. But do you see, Jardine, how the stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner? Don't you understand how, when I reached this point, there rose before me the picture of that cellar with the commonplace objects that it contained? The case, 7 feet by 2½ so convenient for preserving a body in a bulky packing; the 2 waterproof sheets, so well adapted to holding a mass of carbon dioxide snow in contact with the body; the mass of straw, one of the most perfect non-conductors, so admirably fitted for its use as a protective packing for the frozen body; and lastly, those 10 empty cylinders, of which 7 had been used for some purpose unknown to us. Let this case be a lesson to you, Jardine, not only in legal medicine but in clinical medicine too, to take the facts as you find them, relevant or irrelevant, striking or commonplace, note them carefully, and trust them to find their own places in the inductive scheme." "It has been a most instructive lesson to me," said I, "especially your analysis of the reasoning by which you identified the criminal." Said Thorndyke. "I didn't know I'd got as far as that." "But if the body was preserved in a frozen state, there could not be much doubt as to who had preserved it." "Possibly not," Thorndyke agreed. "But I had not proved that it had been so preserved, but only that it was possible for it to have been; and that the supposition of its having been so preserved was in agreement with the known circumstances of the case. But I must impress on you that up to this point I was dealing in pure hypothesis. My hypothesis was perfectly sound, perfectly consistent in all its parts, and perfectly congruous with all the known facts, but it did not follow, therefore, that it was true. It was entirely unverified, for hitherto I had not one single item of positive evidence to support it. Nevertheless, the striking agreement between the hypothesis and the known facts encouraged me greatly, and as it was evident that I had now exhausted the material yielded by the cremation incident, I decided to take up the clue at the other end, to investigate the details of the Hampstead affair. To this end I called on Jardine, who very kindly went over the case with me afresh. And here it was that I first came within hail of positive evidence. On his wall was pinned an oil sketch, and on that sketch was a distinct print of a right thumb. It was beautifully clear, for the paint having been dry on the surface but soft underneath, had taken the impression as sharply as a surface of warm wax. Now, you will remember that I took possession of the letter which summoned Jardine to the mineral water works, and I may now say that I tested it most carefully for finger-prints. But paper is a poor material on which to develop invisible prints, owing to its absorbent nature, and I had very indifferent success. Still, I did not fail entirely. By the combined use of lycopodium powder and photography, I obtained impressions of parts of 2 finger-tips and a portion of the end of a right thumb. They were wretched prints, but yet available for corroboration, since one could see part of the pattern on each and could make out that the ridge pattern of the thumb was of the kind known as a twinned loop. Bearing this fact in mind, you will understand that I was quite interested to find that the print on the sketch, also that of a right thumb, had a twinned loop pattern. I noted the fact as a coincidence, but, of course, attached no importance to it until Jardine told me that the artist who painted the sketch habitually worked in gloves. And even then I merely made a mental note that I would ascertain who and what the artist was. I need not go over our examination of the scene of the crime. I need only say that I was deeply interested in following the track along which the body had been carried because I was on the lookout for something, and that something was a house or other building in which the body might have been temporarily deposited. My hypothesis seemed to demand such a building, for, since the body was quite fresh and rigor mortis was only beginning when Jardine saw it at Gayton Street, it must have been frozen very shortly after death. Now, it obviously could not have been carried from Hampstead to Gayton Street on a man's back. The alternative is either a vehicle waiting at an appointed place, and necessarily not far away, or a house or other building to which the body could be taken. But the vehicle would, under the circumstances, be almost impracticable. It would hardly be possible to make an appointment with any exactness as to time, and the presence of a waiting or loitering vehicle would, at such an hour, it was about midnight, you will remember, be almost certain to arouse suspicion and inquiry. On the other hand, a house to which the body could be conveyed would meet the conditions perfectly. When once the body was deposited there, the danger of pursuit would be practically at an end, and it would be quite possible to have a supply of the liquid gas ready for use on its arrival. This is assuming long premeditation and very deliberate preparation, an assumption supported by Gill's peculiar tenancy of the factory. I therefore kept a sharp look-out for a likely house or building, and as Jardine and I came out of Ken Wood by the turnstile, behold, a house which answered the requirements to perfection. It was a solitary house, there was no other house near, and it lay right on the track along which the body had apparently been carried. Instantly I decided to investigate the recent history of that house and its tenants, but Jardine saved me the trouble. From him I learned that, at the time of the assumed murder, it had been inhabited by the artist whom he had mentioned, but that it had now been empty for a week or two. Here were news indeed. This artist, who habitually wore gloves and whose right thumb-print was a twinned loop, had been living in this house at the time of the assumed murder, but had been living elsewhere at the time of the cremation. It was a striking group of facts, and I eagerly availed myself of the opportunity of looking over the house. At first the examination was quite barren and disappointing. The man's habits, as shown by the few discarded articles of use or other traces, were of no interest to me, and still less to Jardine, and of traces of his personality there were none. I searched all the rejected canvases and every available scrap of paper in the hope of collecting some fresh finger-prints, but without the smallest results. In fact, the examination looked like being an utter failure up to the very last, when we entered the stable loft. But here I came upon one or two really significant traces of occupation. The first of these was a smooth, indented line on the floor, as if some heavy, metallic object had been dragged along it, with other rougher lines apparently made by a heavy wooden case. Then there was a quantity of straw, not new straw such as you might expect to find in a stable loft, but straw that had evidently been used for packing. And finally there was a pair of canvas pliers which appeared to have been strained by a violent effort to rotate from right to left some hard metallic body, 3/4 of an inch wide, with sharp corners and apparently square in section. Some body, in fact, that in shape, in size, and apparently in material was identical with the square of the cock on one of the liquid gas bottles, which appeared to have been connected with a screw thread and had clearly required great force to turn it with this inadequate appliance. The evidence collected from the loft suggesting that a large case had been moved in and out and that a gas cylinder had been opened, you will say was of the flimsiest. And so it was. But the effects of evidence are cumulative. To estimate the value of these observations made in the loft, you must add them to the facts just obtained concerning the artist himself, the position of his house, and the date on which he vacated it. And these coincidences and agreements must be added to, or more strictly, multiplied into, the body of coincidences and agreements which I have already described. But the evidence collected at the house was the least important part of the day's catch. On returning to the Jardines' rooms I ventured to borrow the sketch and took it home with me, and when I compared the thumb print on it with the photograph of the thumb print on the letter, employing the excellent method of comparison that is in use at Scotland Yard, there could be no possible doubt, disregarding for the moment the chances of forgery, that they were the prints of one and the same thumb. Here, then, at last, I had stepped out of the region of mere hypothesis. Here was an item of positive evidence, and one, moreover, of high probative value. It proved beyond any reasonable doubt the existence of some connection between the house on the Heath and the factory in Norton Street, and it established a strong presumption that the artist and the man at the factory were the same person, the weak point in this being the absence of proof that the thumb print on the painting was made by the artist. And here, Jardine, I would draw your attention to the interesting way in which, when a long train of hypothetical reasoning has at length elicited an actual, demonstrable truth, that truth instantly reacts on the hypothesis, lifting it as a whole on to an entirely different plane of probability. I may compare the effect to that of a crystal dropped into a supersaturated solution of salt, such as sodium sulphate. So long as it is at rest, the solution remains a clear liquid, but drop into it the minutest crystal of its own salt, and, in a few moments, the entire liquid has solidified into a mass of crystals. So it was in the present case. In the instant when it became an established fact that the house at Hampstead and the factory in Norton Street had been occupied by the same person, the entire sequence of events which I had hypothetically constructed sprang from the plane of mere conceivability to that of actual probability. It was now more likely than unlikely that the unknown cleric had been murdered, that his body had been conveyed to the artist's house, that it had there been frozen, transferred to the factory, preserved there for some weeks, passed over the wall to the Samways' house, and finally cremated under the name of Septimus Maddock. All that now remained to be done was the verification and identification of the body. As to the first, I examined the will at Somerset House and found it, as the American detectives suspected, a mere notification to the New York authorities that Septimus Maddock was dead. I wrote to the detective agency, and in due course came O'Donnell with the answers to my questions, from which we learned for certain that the artist was Septimus Maddock, and that the assumed peculiarity of the hands consisted of brachydactyly. And then came the good Father Humperdinck to enable us to give a name to the body, and to furnish us with that unlooked-for means of identification. Henceforward all was plain sailing with only one possible source of failure, the possibility that the bullet might have been subsequently extracted. But this was highly improbable. We knew that the wound had healed completely, and it was pretty certain that the bullet was lying quietly enkysted or embedded in the bone. Still, I will confess that I have never in my life been more relieved than I was when my eyes lighted on that dent in the ilium with a stain of lead oxide round it. "So I can imagine," said Jervis. "It was a triumph, and you deserved it. I've never known even my revered senior to work out the theory of a crime more neatly or with less positive matter to work from, and I suppose you have a pretty clear and connected idea of the actual sequence of events." "I think so," replied Thorndyke, "although much of it is necessarily conjectural. I take it that Maddock, while hiding in Bruges under the name of Burton, made the acquaintance of Reinhardt, and saw in the rich, friendless, eccentric bachelor a suitable subject for a crime which he had probably already considered in general terms. I should think that they were probably somewhat alike in appearance, and that the idea of personation was first suggested by the circumstance that they both wore gloves habitually. Maddock will have learned of Reinhardt's intended visit to England, and immediately begun his preparations. His scheme, and a most ingenious one it was, I must confess, was clearly to cause Reinhardt to disappear in one locality and produce his body after a considerable interval in another at some distance. and the house on the Heath was apparently taken with this object, and to be near Reinhardt's haunts. I take it that on the night of the murder Reinhardt had an appointment to visit him at that house, but that, having learned at Miss Vyne's of the sudden illness of Brother Bartholomew, he suddenly altered his plans and refused to go. Then Maddock, who had probably waited for him on the road, seeing his scheme on the point of being wrecked, walked with him as he was going home and took the risk of killing him in Millfield Lane. The risk was not great, considering the time of night and the solitary character of the place, and the distance from the house was not too great for a strong man, as Maddock seems to have been, to carry the body. Death was almost certainly produced by a stab in the back, and Maddock was probably just about to carry the body away when Destiny, in the form of Jardine, appeared. Then Maddock must have lurked, probably behind the fence which had the large hole in it, until Jardine went away, when he must instantly have picked up the body, carried it down the lane, pushed it over the fence, detaching the reliquary as he did so, carried it away to the house, stripped it and proceeded at once to freeze it, having provided a bottle of the gas in readiness. The next morning he will have gone to Marchmont's office, probably dressed in Reinhardt's clothes, from thence to Charing Cross, and with Reinhardt's luggage gone straight on to Paris, leaving the body packed in an abundance of the carbonic acid snow. At Paris he will have made his arrangements with Desire, and then disappeared, returning in disguise to England to carry out the rest of the plan. And a wonderfully clever plan it was, and most ingeniously and resolutely executed. If it had succeeded, and it was within a hair's breadth of succeeding, the hunted criminal, Maddock, would have been beyond the reach of justice for ever, and the fictitious Reinhardt might have lived out his life in luxury and absolute security. As Thorndyke concluded, he rose from his chair, and, stepping over to a cabinet, drew from some inner recess a cigar of melanotic complexion and repulsive aspect. Jervis looked at it and chuckled. "Thorndyke's one dissipation," said he. "At the close of every successful case he proceeds, as a sort of thanksgiving ceremony, to funk us out of these chambers with the smoke of a Trichinopoly cheroot. But listen, don't light it yet, Thorndyke. Here comes some harmless and inoffensive stranger." Thorndyke paused with the cigar in his fingers. A quick step ascended the stairs, and then came a sharp, official rat-tat from the little brass knocker. Thorndyke laid the cigar on the mantelpiece and strode over to the door. I saw him take in a telegram, open it, glance at the paper and dismiss the messenger. Then, closing the door, he came back to the fireside with the flimsy in his hand. "There, Jardine," said he, laying it on my knee. "There is your order of release." I picked up the paper and read aloud its curt message. "Maddock arrested Folkestone, now in custody Bow Street. Miller." "That means to say," said Thorndyke, "that the halter is already round his neck. I think I may light my Trichinopoly now." And he did so. There is little more to tell. This has been a history of coincidences, and one more coincidence brings it to a close. The very day on which my formal engagement to Sylvia was made public chanced to be the day on which the execution of Septimus Maddock was described in the papers. On that day, too, the portrait of poor Letitia, painted by that skilful and murderous hand, was placed in the handsome ebony frame that I had caused to be made for it. As I write these closing words, it hangs before me, flanked on either side by the little jar of violets that are renewed religiously from day to day by my wife or me. The pale, inscrutable eyes look out on me, her friend whom she loved so faithfully, and who so little merited her love. But as I look into them, the picture fades and shows me the same face glorified, waxen, pallid, drowsy-eyed, peaceful and sweet, the dead face of the woman who gave her heart's blood as the price of my ransom, and who was fated then to pass, out of my life indeed, but out of my heart's shrine and my most loving remembrance, never. The End. End of A Silent Witness by R. Austin Freeman. Recorded by Anna Simon. Nijmegen, the Netherlands, 2014.